Hey everyone, tonight we dive into the most devastating conflict the galaxy has ever known. A war so brutal, so catastrophic, that the Republic tried to erase it from history itself. This is the story of how two Jedi heroes became the galaxy's most feared destroyers, plunging countless worlds into darkness and nearly bringing about the end of civilization as we know it. From the mysterious corruption that turned saviors into conquerors to the ancient horrors lurking beyond the edges of known space, this is a tale of power, betrayal, and the terrible price of victory. So before we begin this epic journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into galactic history. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what draws you to these ancient tales of conflict and heroism. It's always amazing to see fellow explorers of forgotten lore from across the world. Now settle in, get comfortable, maybe adjust your lighting for that perfect ambiance, and let's journey back 4,000 years before the Empire to witness the galaxy's darkest hour. Long before the Clone Wars, before the rise of Palpatine, before even the ancient Sith Empire that would terrorize the Old Republic, there existed a golden age. The Republic stretched across thousands of star systems, protected by an order of Jedi Knights whose wisdom and power seemed unshakable. Peace had reigned for generations, broken only by the occasional pirate raid or territorial dispute. The galaxy had grown comfortable, perhaps too comfortable, in its tranquility. But, in the Outer Rim, something stirred. The Mandalorian clans, those legendary warriors who had once conquered entire sectors, began moving again. Their warships emerged from the deep reaches of space like metallic predators, striking without warning at peaceful Republic worlds. Colony after colony fell to their superior tactics and ruthless efficiency. The Senate debated endlessly, while civilians died by the millions. The Jedi Council, bound by ancient traditions and cautious wisdom, forbade intervention. They sensed something deeper at work, some cosmic purpose behind the seemingly random violence. But two young Jedi Knights could not stand idle while innocents suffered. Revan and Malak, heroes already renowned for their courage and skill, defied the Council's orders. They gathered followers, commandeered Republic fleets, and plunged into the Mandalorian wars with righteous fury burning in their hearts. The galaxy watched in awe as these two champions turned the tide of battle. System after system was liberated from Mandalorian occupation. The Republic's armies, inspired by Jedi leadership, fought with renewed vigor. Victory followed victory until finally, in the climactic Battle of Malachor V, the Mandalorian threat was crushed forever. Revan and Malak returned to Coruscant as the greatest heroes the galaxy had ever known. But something had changed in them during those long years of warfare. Those closest to them whispered of strange visions, of secret meetings with captured Mandalorian shamans, of ancient star charts discovered in hidden vaults. The two heroes spoke of threats beyond the Outer Rim, of enemies the Republic had never imagined. They requested permission to pursue the scattered Mandalorian remnants into the unknown regions to ensure the threat could never rise again. The Council, relieved to have their wayward knights volunteer for what seemed like exile, granted their request. With a small fleet of loyal followers, Revan and Malak disappeared into the vast darkness beyond the galactic edge. For 2 years the Republic heard nothing. Peace returned. The Senate assumed their troublesome heroes had either died in the void or found some distant world to call home. They were wrong. When the ships returned, they came not as Republic vessels, but as harbingers of doom. The familiar hulls had been twisted into nightmarish configurations, bristling with weapons of unknown design. The crews wore black armor marked with crimson sigils that hurt to look upon, and leading them, cloaked in shadow and radiating power that made reality itself seem to bend around them, came Revan and Malak. But they were no longer Jedi. They were Sith Lords, Dark Lords of a power and malevolence the galaxy had not seen for millennia. Behind them came an armada that defied comprehension. thousands upon thousands of warships emerged from hyperspace above peaceful worlds, their holds filled with armies of fanatical converts. These were not mere soldiers, but believers in a dark creed that promised strength through suffering, unity through domination, peace through absolute conquest. They spoke of the Starforge, an ancient superweapon that could create infinite fleets, powered by the very life force of the galaxy itself. World after world fell to this new Sith Empire. But this was not mere conquest. There was something systematic about the invasion, something purposeful in the pattern of attacks. Captured populations were not enslaved but converted, subjected to strange rituals that left them changed, hollowed out yet somehow more than they had been before. Ancient temples and archives were not destroyed but claimed, their secrets absorbed into the growing darkness. The Jedi Order, caught completely unprepared, found themselves fighting not just an army, but a plague of corruption that turned friends into enemies, masters into students of shadow. Padawans disappeared in the night, only to return weeks later with yellow eyes and cruel smiles, hunting their former teachers through the very halls where they had once trained. Entire academy worlds went silent, their distress calls ending mid-transmission. And at the heart of it all stood the Starforge itself, that impossible construction of metal and energy that hung in space like a metallic star. From its depths poured not just ships but temples, meditation spheres, and stranger things that the Republic's scouts could barely describe before their minds broke from witnessing them. It was said that within the Starforge's core lay chambers where the laws of physics bent to the will of the dark side, where time moved differently and space folded in on itself. But perhaps most terrifying of all were the whispers that began to spread among the Republic's surviving forces, rumors that this was not the real war at all, but merely preparation for something far worse. Intelligence reports spoke of ancient prophecies discovered in Sith ruins, of warnings about entities from beyond the galaxy's edge, of barriers between realities growing thin. Some claimed that Revan and Malak were not conquerors but guardians, that their terrible crusade was the only thing standing between the galaxy and something that would make the Sith Empire seem like merciful liberators. The question that haunted every Republic world, every Jedi temple, every Senate chamber, was simple yet impossible to answer. What had they found in the unknown regions that could transform heroes into monsters, and was the cure worse than the disease? Tonight we will uncover the truth behind the bloodiest war in galactic history. We will walk the abandoned battlefields where entire star systems died, explore the dark temples where Jedi became Sith, and descend into the very heart of the Starforge to discover what price the galaxy paid for its survival. This is not just a story of war, but of the thin line between salvation and damnation, and the terrible choices that heroes must make when faced with cosmic horror beyond imagination. The galaxy would never be the same, and neither would you once you learn what really happened in those dark years when the stars themselves seemed to bleed. In the deepest vaults of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, where even the Council's most trusted archivists rarely venture, there exists a sealed chamber known only as the Repository of Shadows. Here, among artifacts too dangerous for study and records too terrible for common knowledge, lies the true account of what preceded the galaxy's darkest hour. The official histories speak of the Mandalorian Wars as a conflict between civilization and barbarism, between the Republic's noble ideals and the warrior clan's hunger for conquest. But those who delve deeper into the forbidden archives discover a far more disturbing truth. Master Vrook Lamar, in his final confession before his death on Dantooine, spoke of documents that arrived at the temple 3 months before the first Mandalorian attack. These were not intelligence reports or diplomatic warnings, but fragments of ancient prophecy recovered from ruins on the forgotten world of Kesh. The prophecies spoke of a time when the Sons of Iron would rise from the outer darkness to herald the coming of the true enemy. They described warriors whose faces were hidden behind masks of Beskar steel, whose very presence would awaken something that had slumbered since the dawn of galactic civilization. The Jedi Council in their wisdom chose to dismiss these warnings as the ravings of long-dead mystics. They had grown comfortable in their role as peacekeepers of a peaceful galaxy, their lightsabers more ceremonial than practical after centuries of relative tranquility. The very idea that an ancient threat could emerge from the unknown regions seemed like the stuff of children's nightmares rather than genuine concern for the modern Republic. But in the Outer Rim territories, where the Republic's influence grew thin and old superstitions still held sway, the signs were impossible to ignore. Farmers on Dantooine reported strange dreams that came simultaneously to entire communities, visions of ships like metal birds of prey blotting out the stars. On Tatooine, the Jawa clan spoke in hushed tones of lights moving in patterns no natural phenomenon could explain, formations that seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. Even the criminal syndicates that controlled much of the galactic underworld began to report disruptions in their operations, as if something vast and patient was moving pieces across the galactic chessboard. The first Mandalorian attacks, when they finally came, followed no logical pattern of conquest. Their forces bypassed wealthy core worlds and strategic military installations to strike at seemingly insignificant agricultural colonies and mining outposts. To the Republic's military analysts, these targets made no sense. They possessed no rare resources, no strategic value, no symbolic importance that would justify the massive expenditure of force required to take them. But the Mandalorians did not come as conquerors seeking plunder. They came as archaeologists of destruction, seeking something far more precious than mere wealth. On every world they conquered, Mandalorian forces immediately began extensive excavations. Their warrior engineers dug deep into planetary crusts with a precision that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking for. Ancient ruins were exposed, structures that predated known galactic civilization by millennia. From these sites, the Mandalorians extracted artifacts of unknown composition and purpose, objects that seemed to drink in light and whisper in languages that had been dead since before the first hyperspace routes were charted. Republic intelligence operatives who managed to infiltrate occupied territories reported scenes that defied comprehension. Mandalorian warriors, those legendary pragmatists who valued only strength and honor, were observed conducting elaborate rituals around these ancient artifacts. They would remove their sacred helmets, an act of profound spiritual significance in their culture, and kneel before relics that hurt to look upon directly. Some operatives reported that the very air around these ceremonies seemed to thicken, as if reality itself was being bent by forces beyond understanding. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the changes observed in the Mandalorian forces themselves. Veterans of previous conflicts remembered the warrior clans as chaotic and individualistic, unified only by their shared code of honor and their love of battle. The Mandalorians of this new crusade displayed an eerie coordination, as if they were components of a single vast organism rather than independent warriors. They moved with perfect synchronization across multiple star systems, executing complex strategies that required levels of communication and planning that should have been impossible for a nomadic warrior culture. Intelligence reports from this period, classified so deeply that their very existence is known only to a handful of individuals, describe Mandalorian behavior that violated every principle of their warrior code. Prisoners were not killed in honorable combat, but subjected to strange procedures that left them fundamentally changed. Republic soldiers who were captured and later rescued spoke of chambers deep beneath occupied cities where Mandalorian scientists conducted experiments that seemed to blend technology with something far older and more primal. These rescued prisoners described seeing their captors remove sections of ancient stonework from excavated ruins and somehow integrate them into their own technology. Mandalorian weapons began to exhibit properties that defied known physics. Their starships, once marvels of practical engineering, sprouted organic-looking growths that pulsed with internal light. Most terrifying of all, The warriors themselves began to change, their armor fusing with their bodies in ways that suggested transformation rather than mere augmentation. The Republic's response to this inexplicable threat was hampered by the very prosperity that had defined the era. Senators who had never known true hardship viewed the Mandalorian attacks as an unfortunate but manageable crisis, no different from the periodic pirate raids or corporate disputes that occasionally troubled the Outer Rim. The military, reduced to a largely ceremonial force during the Long Peace, found itself woefully unprepared for warfare on such a scale. Most critically, the Jedi Order remained paralyzed by philosophical debates about the proper role of peacekeepers in an aggressive war. It was during this period of crisis and confusion that Revan and Malak first distinguished themselves. Unlike their peers in the Jedi Order, these two young knights possessed an intuitive understanding of the true nature of the threat facing the Republic. They had studied the Forbidden Archives, delved into records that the Council preferred to keep sealed, and emerged with knowledge that their masters found deeply disturbing. Revan in particular displayed an almost supernatural ability to predict Mandalorian movements and strategies. Fellow Jedi who served alongside him during the early stages of the conflict reported that he would sometimes pause in the middle of battle, his eyes unfocused as if listening to voices only he could hear. When asked about these moments, Revan would speak of patterns within patterns, of ancient rhythms that governed the flow of galactic events, like tides governed the movement of oceans. Malak, though less mystically inclined than his companion, possessed a tactical brilliance that allowed him to translate Revan's insights into practical military action. Together, they began to develop strategies that seemed to anticipate not just what the Mandalorians would do, but why they were doing it. They recognized that this was not merely a war of conquest, but a vast ritual, a ceremony conducted on a galactic scale for purposes that reached far beyond the simple acquisition of territory. The turning point came when Republic forces under Revan's command captured an intact Mandalorian archaeological site on the world of Onderon. What they discovered there would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives and set in motion the events that would nearly destroy the galaxy. Deep beneath the planet's surface, Mandalorian excavations had uncovered a chamber that existed in partial defiance of normal space-time. The walls were covered with inscriptions in a script that predated known galactic languages, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. At the center of this chamber stood an obelisk of black stone that absorbed light so completely it appeared to be a wound in reality itself. Around its base, Mandalorian warriors had arranged hundreds of artifacts recovered from sites across the galaxy, creating a pattern that suggested both worship and summoning. Republic scientists who attempted to study the obelisk reported equipment failures that followed no known physical laws, instruments that registered readings for forces that did not exist in conventional physics. But it was the chamber's effect on force-sensitive individuals that truly revealed its sinister nature. Jedi who entered the space reported an immediate sense of wrongness, as if the very fabric of the Force had been torn and rewoven into alien patterns. Some experienced visions of vast intelligences moving between galaxies, entities so ancient and powerful that their mere proximity could reshape reality according to their will. Others spoke of hearing whispers in their minds, offers of knowledge and power that came with prices too terrible to contemplate. Revan spent 3 days in that chamber, emerging with eyes that had seen too much and knowledge that no mortal mind should possess. When questioned by the Jedi Council about what he had learned, he spoke only of preparation and necessity, of threats that made the Mandalorian crusade seem like a gentle warning compared to what was coming. He requested access to the deepest archives of the Jedi Temple, to records that had been sealed since the Order's founding. When this was refused, he began to make his own investigations, using resources and methods that the Council found increasingly troubling. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the nature of the Mandalorian threat was evolving in ways that defied all attempts at understanding. Worlds that had been conquered months earlier began to exhibit changes that went far beyond the usual devastation of war. The very geology of these planets seemed to be shifting, as if the rock and soil were being slowly transformed into something else entirely. Reconnaissance flights over occupied territories reported cloud formations that moved in mathematically precise patterns, weather systems that responded to no known atmospheric laws. Most disturbing of all were the reports from long-range sensors monitoring the conquered worlds. These planets were not simply being strip-mined or colonized in the conventional sense. Instead, they appeared to be undergoing a fundamental transformation, their mass and energy signatures changing in ways that suggested they were being converted into components of some vast machine. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through the Republic's scientific community and prompted emergency sessions of the Jedi Council. It was during one of these sessions that Master Kavar made his fateful observation, recorded in archives, that would later be sealed by order of the Chancellor himself. Looking at the accumulated evidence of Mandalorian activities across dozens of star systems, the venerable Jedi Master recognized a pattern that chilled him to his very core. The conquered worlds, when viewed as a single network rather than individual targets, formed a three-dimensional mandala of incredible complexity. This was not random conquest but precise construction, the systematic creation of a galactic-scale apparatus for purposes that reached beyond conventional warfare. The realization that the Mandalorian Crusade was merely the first phase of something far more ambitious sent ripples of fear through every level of Republic society. Emergency powers were granted to the Chancellor. Military production was increased 100-fold, and for the first time in centuries, the Senate authorized the creation of weapons designed specifically for planetary annihilation. But even as these preparations were being made, a growing number of voices within the government began to suggest that conventional warfare might not be sufficient to address the threat they faced. It was in this atmosphere of escalating desperation that Revan made his proposal to the Jedi Council. He had discovered, through his investigation of the Onderon site and other recovered Mandalorian artifacts, references to technologies and strategies that might be capable of countering the alien influence behind the Crusade. But accessing this knowledge would require him to travel beyond the edges of known space, into regions where the very laws of physics might operate according to different principles. The Council's refusal of this request led to the schism that would define the remainder of the war. Revan and Malak, along with a significant portion of the younger Jedi Order, chose to defy their masters and pursue the war effort on their own terms. They commandeered Republic vessels, recruited armies of volunteers, and began their own campaign against the Mandalorian forces. But their methods were different from those employed by conventional Republic forces, influenced by the terrible knowledge they had gained from the alien artifacts. As the war progressed, observers noted disturbing changes in the Jedi rebels who had chosen to follow Revan. They displayed tactical insights that bordered on precognition, able to anticipate enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. Their lightsaber techniques incorporated elements that no Jedi Academy had ever taught, forms that seemed to bend space and time around the wielder. Most concerning of all, they began to employ weapons and strategies that mirrored those of their Mandalorian enemies, as if they were learning to fight fire with fire regardless of the cost to their own souls. The climactic battle of Malachor V, where the Mandalorian Crusade finally ended, was won through the deployment of a weapon that violated every principle the Jedi Order held sacred. The Mass Shadow Generator, a device of Revan's own design, destroyed not just the Mandalorian fleet, but the planet itself, creating a wound in the Force that would never fully heal. In that moment of terrible victory, something fundamental changed in the galaxy's spiritual landscape, as if the very concept of absolute good and evil had been compromised by the necessities of survival. The Mandalorians who survived the battle were fundamentally broken, their warrior culture shattered by their exposure to forces they could not comprehend. But in their defeat, they left behind a legacy of knowledge and artifacts that would continue to influence galactic events for millennia to come. The Republic had won the war, but at a cost that would not be fully understood until it was far too late to change course. In the aftermath of Malachor V, as the galaxy celebrated the end of the Mandalorian threat, Revan and Malak stood among the wreckage of their victory and contemplated what they had learned, the artifacts they had recovered, the knowledge they had gained, the terrible necessities they had embraced, all pointed toward a single inescapable conclusion. The Mandalorian crusade had been merely the opening movement of a far grander symphony of destruction, and the true enemy had yet to reveal itself. As they prepared for their expedition into the unknown regions, ostensibly to hunt down the remaining Mandalorian survivors, Revan and Malak carried with them secrets that would reshape the galaxy. They had learned that survival sometimes required becoming the very thing one sought to destroy, that the greatest threats to civilization often came wearing the faces of its greatest protectors. The war with the Mandalorians was over, but the real battle for the soul of the galaxy was just beginning. Beyond the galactic rim, where the last hyperspace beacons fade into static and the familiar constellations surrender to alien geometries, lies a realm that has haunted spacefaring civilizations since the first brave souls learned to navigate the cosmic void. The unknown regions, as they came to be called by Republic cartographers, represent more than mere uncharted space. They are a testament to the fundamental limitations of mortal knowledge, a cosmic frontier where the very concepts of distance and direction lose their meaning. When Revan and Malak departed Coruscant with their small fleet of loyal followers, the Republic's leadership breathed a collective sigh of relief. The two former Jedi had become increasingly difficult to manage in the aftermath of their victory over the Mandalorians, their methods growing ever more pragmatic and their questions ever more uncomfortable for the Senate to answer. The Council, in particular, was eager to see the last of knights who had proven themselves willing to use forbidden knowledge and deploy weapons of mass destruction in service of what they called the greater good. The official records state that the expedition consisted of 17 Republic vessels, primarily light cruisers and reconnaissance ships suitable for long-range exploration. The fleet carried approximately 4,000 personnel, including former Jedi, Republic military officers who had served under Revan during the Mandalorian Wars, and a carefully selected group of scientists and archaeologists. To the public, this appeared to be a standard pursuit mission, designed to ensure that the scattered remnants of the Mandalorian forces could not regroup and threaten the Republic's hard-won peace. But the truth, as preserved in the deepest archives of the Jedi Temple, reveals a far more complex and troubling purpose. The expedition carried with it a collection of artifacts recovered from Mandalorian archaeological sites, relics that had been deemed too dangerous for study within the Republic's borders. Among these were fragments of star charts, etched in metals that did not exist in the known galaxy, crystalline matrices that pulsed with their own internal light, and most disturbing of all, a series of stone tablets covered in inscriptions that seemed to rewrite themselves when observed over extended periods. Revan's personal journals, discovered centuries later in a hidden vault on Korriban, provide the only first-hand account of the expedition's true objectives. He wrote of visions that had plagued him since his encounter with the Mandalorian artifacts, dreams of vast entities moving through the space between galaxies like cosmic predators following ancient migration routes. These beings, he claimed, operated on scales of time and space that rendered conventional mortal concerns meaningless, but their influence could be felt wherever intelligent life had evolved beyond a certain threshold of technological sophistication. The journey into the unknown regions began innocuously enough, with the fleet following conventional hyperspace routes toward the coordinates where the last Mandalorian forces had been detected. But as they moved further from the galactic core, the familiar patterns of space and time began to exhibit subtle distortions. Navigation became increasingly difficult as hyperspace lanes shifted without warning, and several vessels reported chronometer malfunctions that suggested time itself was flowing at different rates for different ships within the same fleet. Malak's tactical logs describe encounters with phenomena that defied all known physics. Entire star systems appeared to exist in states of temporal flux, with planets orbiting suns that aged billions of years in the span of standard hours. The fleet discovered ancient ruins on worlds that, according to stellar cartography, should have been lifeless balls of molten rock. These structures exhibited architectural principles that seemed to mock the very concept of three-dimensional space, with corridors that led to rooms larger than the buildings that contained them and staircases that descended infinitely upward. On the third world they investigated, a planet designated only as Target Epsilon in the expedition's encrypted communications, the fleet made a discovery that would alter the course of galactic history. Deep beneath the planet's crystalline surface, Revan's archaeological teams uncovered what appeared to be a massive complex of chambers and passages constructed from materials that exhibited properties unknown to Republic science. The walls were covered with the same shifting inscriptions they had observed on the Mandalorian artifacts. But here the symbols were arranged in vast spiraling patterns that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. At the center of this complex, the expedition discovered something that challenged every assumption about the nature of intelligent life in the universe. It was a chamber containing what could only be described as a library, but one designed for minds that operated according to principles utterly alien to human comprehension. The knowledge stored within this facility was not contained in books or data crystals, but encoded directly into the fabric of space-time itself. To access this information required not technological interfaces, but a fundamental alteration of consciousness, a willingness to allow one's own mental patterns to be reshaped by forces that existed beyond the conventional boundaries of individual identity. Revan, driven by a combination of desperation and intellectual curiosity that had characterized his entire career, submitted himself to the process of accessing this alien knowledge. The transformation was immediate and profound. His consciousness expanded beyond the limitations of his physical form, allowing him to perceive patterns and connections that spanned galactic distances and temporal epochs. He saw the true scope of the threat that had driven the Mandalorian crusade, entities so ancient and powerful that they had shaped the evolution of entire galactic clusters to serve their incomprehensible purposes. But knowledge of this magnitude came with a price that no mortal mind could pay without fundamental alteration. As Revan absorbed the contents of the alien library, his personality began to fragment and reconstitute itself according to patterns that reflected the cosmic forces he had encountered. His capacity for empathy, once the defining characteristic of his identity as a Jedi, was gradually subsumed by a cold pragmatism that viewed individual suffering as acceptable collateral damage in service of species survival. Malak, witnessing his companion's transformation, faced a choice that would define his own path toward darkness. He could abandon Revan to his fate and return to the Republic with warnings about the dangers of delving too deeply into forbidden knowledge, or he could join his friend in embracing the terrible wisdom they had discovered. The bonds of friendship and loyalty that had sustained them through the Mandalorian Wars ultimately proved stronger than his fear of the unknown, and Malak chose to undergo the same process of transformation that had remade his companion. The alien library revealed truths about the nature of the galaxy that shattered every comfortable assumption about the relationship between civilization and cosmic order. The entities that had influenced the Mandalorian crusade were not invaders from beyond the galactic rim, but refugees from a far more ancient catastrophe. They had once been the dominant intelligence in a galaxy that had been consumed by forces even more alien and terrible than themselves, and their flight to this region of space represented not conquest but desperate survival. These refugees had spent millions of years preparing for the eventual arrival of their pursuers, entities that fed on the complexity of organized matter and would systematically dismantle every structure larger than a molecule once they reached this galaxy. The Mandalorian crusade, the alien library revealed, had been an attempt to accelerate the development of local military capabilities by forcing the galaxy's inhabitants to confront existential threats that would prepare them for the far greater challenges to come. But the refugee entities had underestimated the resilience and adaptability of the species they had encountered in this galaxy. Rather than simply becoming tools in their defensive preparations, beings like Revan and Malak had proven capable of absorbing and ultimately transcending the alien knowledge they had been exposed to. The library contained not just information about the approaching threat, but detailed instructions for transforming entire civilizations into weapons capable of fighting entities that existed beyond conventional space-time. The process of implementing these instructions would require the systematic remaking of galactic civilization according to principles that bore no resemblance to the values and institutions that had defined the Republic. Entire populations would need to be converted into components of a vast biological and technological machine, their individual identities subsumed into a collective consciousness capable of operating on cosmic scales. The transformation would be traumatic and irreversible, but it represented the only possible path to survival in a universe where the very existence of complex matter was under constant threat. As Revan and Malak absorbed this knowledge, they began to understand the true scope of their responsibility. They were no longer Jedi Knights serving the Republic, but evolutionary catalysts tasked with preparing their species for a transition that would redefine the very meaning of existence. The methods required for this transformation would appear to be acts of conquest and oppression to those who could not perceive the cosmic context, but they represented the only alternative to extinction for every sentient being in the galaxy. The alien library also contained detailed specifications for technologies that could accelerate the necessary transformation. Among these was a device known as the Star Forge, a construction that could convert stellar energy directly into matter and organize that matter according to patterns encoded in the user's consciousness. With such a device, the process of remaking galactic civilization could be accomplished within a few decades rather than the millennia that would otherwise be required. But the Starforge was not simply a tool for manufacturing ships and weapons. It was a teaching device designed to gradually educate its operators in the principles of cosmic scale engineering and consciousness manipulation. Each vessel produced by the Starforge would carry within its structure microscopic elements that would begin the process of transforming their crews according to the alien patterns. Over time, these transformed individuals would become the seeds of a new kind of civilization, one capable of surviving in a universe where the fundamental forces of existence were actively hostile to the emergence of complexity. The expedition's final discovery was a set of coordinates that led to the Starforge's location, hidden within a nebula that existed in partial defiance of normal space-time. The journey to reach this device would require navigating through regions where the boundary between the physical universe and the realm of pure consciousness had become blurred, a passage that would complete the transformation of Revan and Malak from heroes of the Republic into architects of a new galactic order. As their fleet prepared for the final leg of their journey, the two former Jedi stood on the observation deck of their flagship and contemplated the magnitude of what they had learned. The galaxy they had sworn to protect was doomed to destruction unless they were willing to destroy it themselves, remaking it according to principles that would horrify everyone they had once called friend. The choice before them was not between good and evil, but between extinction and transformation, between the comfortable lies of civilization and the harsh truths of cosmic survival. The transmission they sent back to the Republic before beginning their final approach to the Starforge would be their last communication with the civilization they had once served. In it, they spoke of threats beyond imagination and preparations beyond comprehension, of sacrifices that would seem like betrayals to those who could not see the larger pattern. They asked for understanding they knew would never come, and forgiveness for actions that would appear unforgivable to minds that had not been expanded by contact with cosmic truth. The Republic received this transmission with confusion and concern, but its true meaning would not become clear until the transformed fleet returned to known space. By then, Revan and Malak would no longer be the heroes who had saved the galaxy from the Mandalorian threat, but the architects of a new and terrible kind of war, one that would push every inhabitant of the galaxy to the very limits of their capacity for survival and growth. The unknown regions had claimed another expedition, but this time the darkness that emerged from beyond the galactic rim wore familiar faces and spoke in voices that had once offered comfort and hope. The true horror of what was to come lay not in the alien nature of the threat, but in the recognition that sometimes salvation could only be achieved through the willing embrace of what appeared to be damnation. The first ships to emerge from hyperspace above Coruscant bore the familiar silhouettes of Republic vessels, their hull markings still visible beneath layers of what appeared to be battle damage. Traffic control operators in the orbital stations initially logged them as survivors of the unknown regions expedition, perhaps returning with news of successful operations against the remaining Mandalorian forces. The relief was palpable throughout the Republic Navy's high command as reports filtered in of Revan and Malak's apparent survival and the safe return of at least a portion of their fleet. But as the vessels drew closer to the planet's defensive perimeter, subtle details began to emerge that transformed relief into growing unease. The ships moved with an uncanny precision, their formations adhering to mathematical patterns that seemed to echo the alien geometries discovered in Mandalorian archaeological sites. More disturbing still were the modifications visible on their hulls, organic-looking growths that pulsed with internal bioluminescence and seemed to respond to unseen stimuli like living tissue. The communication that finally came from the lead vessel carried voices that were recognizable yet profoundly changed. Revan and Malak spoke with the same tonal patterns and vocabulary that had characterized their previous transmissions, but underlying their words was something that made veteran communications officers instinctively recoil from their headsets. The semantic content of their messages was conventional enough: requests for orbital clearance and permission to establish temporary bases on Republic worlds, but the subaudible frequencies seemed to carry information that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primitive survival instincts buried deep within the human brainstem. The Jedi Council, sensing disturbances in the Force that coincided with the fleet's arrival, dispatched teams of knights to conduct discreet observations of the returning expedition members. What they discovered defied every assumption about the nature of identity and consciousness that had guided Jedi philosophy for millennia. The individuals who disembarked from those ships retained the physical appearance and surface personality traits of the Republic personnel who had departed years earlier. But deeper examination revealed transformations so fundamental that the very concept of personal identity had become meaningless. These transformed beings possessed memories and emotional responses that perfectly matched their original personalities, but these characteristics had been reorganized according to principles that served purposes far beyond individual survival or satisfaction. They moved with the coordinated precision of components in a vast machine, their actions guided by imperatives that originated from sources outside their conscious awareness. Most disturbing of all, they seemed genuinely unaware that any transformation had taken place, viewing their altered state as a natural evolution rather than an imposed change. The technology they brought with them represented advances that should have required centuries of development, devices that seemed to blend Republic engineering principles with innovations derived from entirely alien sources. Their weapons incorporated living components that grew and adapted in response to tactical situations, while their communications equipment established connections across galactic distances without relying on conventional hyperspace relay networks. Most significantly, they possessed manufacturing capabilities that could produce complex devices from raw materials using processes that appeared to violate fundamental laws of physics. Within weeks of their return, the transformed expedition members had established industrial facilities on dozens of Republic worlds, ostensibly to assist with the ongoing process of post-war reconstruction. These installations were welcomed by local governments desperate to rebuild their damaged infrastructure, but careful observers noted that the construction patterns followed designs that bore no resemblance to conventional Republic architecture. The buildings seemed to grow rather than being assembled, their walls incorporating materials that exhibited properties that existing scientific theories could not explain. The industrial output of these facilities was staggering, producing ships, weapons, and equipment at rates that dwarfed the Republic's largest manufacturing centers. But the true purpose of this production became clear only when intelligence analysts began to map the distribution patterns of the manufactured goods. Rather than being allocated according to military necessity or economic efficiency, the equipment was being positioned to create a three-dimensional network that spanned the entire galaxy, with each installation serving as a node in a vast communication and control system. The recruitment methods employed by Revan and Malak's organization were subtle but inexorable, targeting individuals who possessed specific psychological profiles and skill sets that made them suitable for integration into the expanding network. Rather than relying on conventional propaganda or coercion, they used techniques that seemed to reach directly into the subconscious minds of potential recruits, awakening dormant potentials and redirecting existing motivations towards service to the greater cause. Young Republic officers who had distinguished themselves during the Mandalorian Wars found themselves drawn to recruitment centers where they underwent evaluation processes that seemed more like mystical initiations than military assessments. Those who were selected for advanced training disappeared for months at a time, returning with enhanced capabilities and an unwavering dedication to objectives that they could never quite articulate in terms that outsiders could understand. The transformation process itself was gradual and apparently voluntary, with subjects reporting increased clarity of thought and purpose as they progressed through successive stages of integration. They retained their individual personalities and relationships, but these characteristics were subtly reconfigured to support the collective objectives of the organization. Friends and family members noticed changes, but these alterations were so gradual and seemed so positive that they aroused little concern until the process was far too advanced to reverse. Jedi who attempted to investigate the recruitment centers using force-based perception techniques reported encountering barriers that seemed to exist outside normal space-time, shields that deflected mental intrusion without causing the violent backlash typically associated with dark side defenses. Some knights who pushed too aggressively against these barriers found their own consciousness becoming entangled with the networks they were trying to penetrate, experiencing moments of expanded awareness that left them fundamentally changed by the contact. The most disturbing aspect of the spreading transformation was its effect on the Jedi Order itself. Young Padawans began to report dreams and visions that seemed to offer solutions to philosophical problems that had puzzled the Order for generations, insights that came with the subtle suggestion that conventional Jedi teachings were incomplete preparations for the challenges facing the galaxy. These revelations were often accompanied by invitations to visit facilities where more complete instruction could be provided by teachers who had transcended the limitations of traditional Force techniques. Master Vrok'Lamar's investigation into these phenomena led him to a hidden facility on the agricultural world of Dantooine, where he discovered a training complex that existed in partial concealment from normal perception. The structure appeared to be simultaneously a conventional educational institution and something far more sophisticated, with chambers that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions and corridors that connected to rooms located on entirely different planets. The students, he observed, there were recognizably Jedi, still carrying their lightsabers and displaying the disciplined behavior characteristic of the Order, but they had been subtly transformed by exposure to teaching methods that incorporated principles drawn from the alien knowledge discovered in the unknown regions. Their Force techniques demonstrated capabilities that far exceeded anything achieved through conventional training. But these abilities came with a cost that was not immediately apparent to casual observation. These transformed Jedi moved with perfect coordination, their actions guided by shared objectives that seemed to emerge from collective decision-making processes rather than individual choice. They retained their capacity for independent thought and emotional response, But these characteristics had been integrated into a larger pattern of consciousness that prioritized the survival and development of the galaxy as a whole over the concerns of any individual or group. The ethical implications of this transformation were staggering, raising questions about the nature of free will and the relationship between individual identity and collective purpose that the Jedi Council was ill-equipped to address. The transformed beings were not evil in any conventional sense, nor were they acting against their own will or the welfare of others, but they had become something other than fully human, components in a vast intelligence that operated according to principles that transcended the moral frameworks that had guided galactic civilization for millennia. As reports of similar facilities spread across the galaxy, the Republic's leadership began to realize that they were facing not a conventional military threat, but a form of evolutionary pressure that was systematically transforming the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. The process was voluntary, gradual, and apparently beneficial to those who underwent it, but its ultimate objectives remained unclear to those who retained their original human consciousness. The industrial and technological capabilities demonstrated by the transformed populations grew at an exponential rate, producing innovations that solved problems that had plagued the Republic for centuries. Worlds that had been devastated by the Mandalorian Wars were restored to prosperity within months, their populations enjoying levels of health, education, and material comfort that far exceeded pre-war standards. But these improvements came with integration into networks of control and communication that gradually eroded the independence and unpredictability that had characterized human civilization throughout its history. The Republic Senate found itself increasingly reliant on the transformed populations for essential services and advanced technologies, even as growing numbers of senators and their staffs underwent the transformation process themselves. Policy decisions began to reflect priorities and perspectives that seemed to emerge from sources beyond the normal democratic processes, guided by considerations that extended far beyond the traditional concerns of planetary governments and regional interests. The military implications of the transformation were perhaps most significant of all. The fleets that emerged from the hidden shipyards established by Revan and Malak represented advances in spacecraft design that made conventional Republic vessels seem like primitive toys by comparison. These ships incorporated living components that could adapt to battlefield conditions in real-time weapon systems that seemed to anticipate enemy actions before they were initiated, and defensive capabilities that rendered most existing military technologies obsolete. But the true strategic advantage of the transformed forces lay not in their superior equipment, but in their operational capabilities. They moved with perfect coordination across multiple star systems, executing complex strategies that required no conventional communication or command structure. Each individual unit seemed to possess complete awareness of the overall tactical situation, responding to changing conditions with a speed and precision that no traditional military organization could match. The psychological warfare aspects of their operations were perhaps even more effective than their conventional military capabilities. Populations that encountered the transformed forces found themselves facing enemies who retained familiar human appearances and spoke in recognizable voices, but whose actions were guided by motivations that seemed to transcend individual self-interest. Rather than the brutal conquest typically associated with military occupation, these forces offered integration into a collective consciousness that promised to solve the fundamental problems of existence that had plagued sentient beings throughout history. The resistance movements that formed in response to the expanding transformation faced challenges that conventional guerrilla warfare tactics could not address. Their enemies possessed complete knowledge of local conditions and population dynamics, derived not from intelligence gathering, but from direct mental connection with transformed members of the local community. More problematically, many resistance fighters found themselves questioning the legitimacy of their cause when confronted with evidence that the transformed populations were genuinely happier, healthier, and more prosperous than they had been under conventional Republic governance. The philosophical and theological implications of the transformation crisis created schisms within every major institution of galactic civilization. Religious organizations struggled to determine whether the loss of individual consciousness represented spiritual transcendence or damnation, while academic institutions debated whether the enhanced capabilities demonstrated by transformed individuals constituted genuine progress or a form of sophisticated slavery. Even criminal organizations found their traditional power structures disrupted as transformed operatives demonstrated capabilities that made conventional crime both unnecessary and impossible to conceal. The most disturbing aspect of the spreading transformation, from the perspective of those who retained their original consciousness, was its apparent irreversibility. Individuals who had undergone the process showed no desire to return to their previous state of existence, even when presented with evidence that their personalities and priorities had been fundamentally altered. They retained clear memories of their former lives and relationships, but these experiences had been recontextualized within a larger framework of meaning that made their previous concerns seem trivial by comparison. Medical and psychological examination of transformed individuals revealed changes that extended far beyond the neurological modifications that might be expected from advanced brainwashing techniques. Their cellular structure had been altered at the molecular level, incorporating elements that did not exist in the known periodic table and exhibiting biological processes that seemed to draw energy from sources beyond conventional metabolism. Most significantly, they displayed measurable improvements in cognitive function, emotional stability, and physical health that suggested genuine enhancement rather than mere control. The economic implications of the transformation were staggering, as transformed populations demonstrated productivity levels that far exceeded anything achieved by conventional human labor. Their industrial facilities operated with perfect efficiency, producing goods of unprecedented quality while consuming minimal resources and generating no waste products. More importantly, they seem to have solved the fundamental problem of resource allocation that had driven economic conflict throughout galactic history, with each individual contributing according to their capabilities and receiving according to their needs, without any apparent enforcement mechanism. The Republic's attempts to contain the spread of transformation through military intervention proved counterproductive, as conventional forces found themselves outmatched by enemies who possessed complete tactical awareness and seemed genuinely motivated by concern for the welfare of their opponents. Rather than destroying resistance forces, the transformed armies typically sought to capture and convert their enemies, offering them opportunities to join the collective consciousness voluntarily rather than facing destruction. Intelligence reports from this period describe battles where transformed forces would disable enemy weapons and communication systems without causing casualties, then engage their opponents in philosophical discussions about the nature of existence and the inevitability of evolutionary change. Many Republic soldiers found these encounters more psychologically challenging than conventional combat, as they were forced to confront questions about the purpose and meaning of their resistance that their training had not prepared them to answer. The Jedi Order's response to the transformation crisis was hampered by internal divisions that reflected broader uncertainties about the nature of the threat they faced. Some masters argued that the loss of individual consciousness represented a fundamental violation of the natural order that must be resisted at all costs, while others suggested that the enhanced capabilities and apparent contentment of transformed individuals indicated that the process might represent genuine spiritual evolution rather than corruption. These philosophical debates were complicated by practical considerations, as Jedi who attempted to use the Force to combat transformed individuals discovered that conventional dark side techniques were ineffective against opponents who displayed no anger, fear, or hatred. The transformed beings seemed to exist in a state of perfect emotional balance, their actions guided by collective wisdom rather than individual passion, making them immune to many of the psychological manipulation techniques that Jedi had traditionally employed against dark side practitioners. Master Kavar's secret investigation into the transformation phenomenon led him to conclude that the process represented something entirely new in the galaxy's history, a form of evolutionary pressure that operated according to principles that existing philosophical and scientific frameworks could not adequately address. His classified report to the Jedi Council warned that traditional concepts of good and evil were inadequate tools for understanding a threat that might represent the next stage in the development of intelligent life. The cultural impact of the transformation extended far beyond the political and military spheres, as artists, writers, and musicians who underwent the process began producing works that exhibited unprecedented sophistication and emotional depth. These creations seemed to tap into collective unconscious patterns that resonated with audiences across species boundaries, suggesting that the transformation might be unlocking creative potentials that had remained dormant throughout the history of galactic civilization. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of the expanding transformation was its effect on children born to transformed parents. These offspring displayed capabilities that far exceeded normal human potential from birth, demonstrating telepathic abilities, enhanced physical coordination, and cognitive development that progressed at rates that should have been impossible according to existing theories of human development. More significantly, they seemed to be born with innate knowledge of the collective objectives that guided their parents, suggesting that the transformation was creating a new form of inherited consciousness that would persist across generations. The Republic's scientific community struggled to develop countermeasures against a phenomenon that seemed to operate according to principles that violated fundamental assumptions about the nature of biology and consciousness. Research facilities established to study the transformation process found their personnel gradually succumbing to the same changes they were attempting to understand, as exposure to transformed subjects seemed to initiate subtle alterations in brain chemistry that eventually led to voluntary integration into the collective consciousness. The failure of conventional resistance methods led some Republic leaders to consider increasingly desperate alternatives, including the development of weapons designed to target the neurological modifications that enabled the transformation process. But these efforts were complicated by ethical concerns about the use of such weapons against beings who retained human appearance and behavior patterns, even if their underlying consciousness had been fundamentally altered. As the transformation continued to spread across the galaxy, affecting not just human populations but members of other species as well, it became clear that the Republic was facing an existential crisis that challenged every assumption about the nature of civilization and individual identity. The choice before galactic society was not simply between freedom and slavery, but between maintaining the chaotic unpredictability of individual consciousness and embracing a form of collective existence that promised unprecedented prosperity and security at the cost of personal autonomy. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine not just the political future of the galaxy, but the fundamental nature of what it meant to be a sentient being, in a universe where the boundaries between individual and collective consciousness had become increasingly meaningless. The war that was coming would be fought not just with ships and weapons, but with competing visions of what intelligent life could become when freed from the limitations that had defined it throughout history. The assassination attempt that shattered the partnership between Revan and Malak occurred not in the heat of battle, but during a moment of apparent triumph that would forever alter the course of galactic history. The two former Jedi stood together on the bridge of their flagship, watching as the latest Republic stronghold surrendered to their overwhelming forces when the carefully planned betrayal finally reached its culmination. The explosion that tore through the command deck was not the random violence of war, but the calculated strike of a subordinate who believed himself ready to assume leadership of the transformation process. Malak's decision to destroy his former friend and mentor had been months in the making, influenced by subtle manipulations that he himself did not fully understand. The collective consciousness that had reshaped both their minds operated according to principles that sometimes required the sacrifice of individual components for the greater good of the whole, and Malik had gradually been prepared to serve as the instrument of Revan's removal. The process had been so gradual and seemed so logical that he experienced it not as betrayal but as natural evolution, the inevitable result of his own growth beyond the limitations that had once defined his relationship with his former companion. The Republic's celebration of Revan's apparent death was premature and based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the true nature of their enemy. Intelligence reports suggested that the destruction of the Sith Lord had created a power vacuum within the enemy organization that would lead to internal conflict and eventual collapse. Military strategists predicted that Malik's assumption of sole leadership would result in tactical errors and strategic miscalculations that Republic forces could exploit to reclaim lost territory and eventually drive the invaders back to whatever corner of the unknown regions had spawned them. But the transformation that had remade Revan and Malak operated according to principles that transcended individual identity and personal ambition. The consciousness that had guided their actions since their return from the unknown regions was not dependent on any single personality or physical form, but existed as a distributed intelligence that could function through multiple individuals simultaneously. Revan's death, rather than representing a genuine loss, had simply triggered a redistribution of responsibilities within the collective that made the overall organization more resilient rather than weaker. Malik's assumption of leadership was not the result of personal ambition, but the implementation of a contingency plan that had been embedded within the collective consciousness from its earliest stages. His tactical approach differed from Revan's in style and emphasis, but both were expressions of the same underlying intelligence that had been shaped by contact with the alien knowledge discovered in the unknown regions. The Republic's analysts, lacking any understanding of the true nature of their enemy, interpreted these stylistic differences as evidence of fundamental strategic changes that created new opportunities for resistance. The initial Republic counteroffensives that followed Revan's death achieved tactical successes that seemed to confirm the military leadership's optimistic assessments. Several previously impregnable strongholds fell to renewed Republic attacks, and intelligence reports suggested that the enemy's industrial capacity had been significantly disrupted by the leadership transition. Planets that had been completely integrated into the transformation network began to show signs of reduced coordination and efficiency, leading many to believe that the process of collective consciousness was inherently unstable without strong central leadership. These apparent victories masked a far more complex reality that would not become clear until the Republic's forces had been lured into positions where they could be systematically destroyed or captured. Malik's tactical retreats were not signs of weakness, but elements of a sophisticated strategy designed to concentrate enemy forces in locations where they could be most effectively subjected to transformation procedures. The reduction in industrial output was a temporary reallocation of resources toward projects that would ultimately prove far more significant than the mass production of conventional weapons and spacecraft. The Republic's intelligence services, still operating according to principles developed for analyzing conventional enemies, failed to recognize that their apparent successes were actually components of a larger plan that operated on timescales that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The enemy's behavior patterns suggested long-term objectives that were incompatible with the short-term thinking that had characterized previous galactic conflicts. But the implications of this observation were not fully understood until it was far too late to alter the course of events. The most significant misunderstanding concerned the true nature of the Starforge, the ancient superweapon that had enabled the rapid expansion of the enemy's military capabilities. Republic analysts assumed that the device was simply a manufacturing facility, albeit one that operated according to principles that exceeded their technological understanding. The destruction of Revan, they believed, would disrupt the coordination between the Starforge and the forces it supplied, creating opportunities for direct attacks on the facility itself. In reality, the Star Forge was not merely a tool for producing ships and weapons, but a teaching device designed to gradually educate its operators in the principles of cosmic-scale engineering and consciousness manipulation. Each interaction with the device provided its users with deeper insights into the alien knowledge that had been discovered in the unknown regions, and the temporary disruption caused by Revan's death actually accelerated Malak's integration with the device's more advanced capabilities. The Republic's attempted assault on the Star Forge itself represented the culmination of a strategic plan that had been developed over months of careful analysis and preparation. The attack force consisted of the Republic's most advanced warships, crewed by veterans of the Mandalorian Wars and equipped with experimental weapons designed specifically to penetrate the exotic defenses that protected the ancient facility. The mission's success seemed guaranteed by intelligence reports that suggested the Star Forge's defensive systems had been weakened by the recent leadership transition. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of galactic warfare, as Republic forces found themselves engaged not just with conventional enemy fleets, but with manifestations of the Star Forge itself that seemed to exist in partial defiance of normal space-time. The facility's defensive systems included capabilities that turned the attacking vessel's own weapons against them, while simultaneously subjecting their crews to psychological influences that gradually eroded their resistance to the transformation process. Admiral Carthonasi's final transmission before his flagship was overwhelmed by enemy forces provided the first clear indication that the Republic's understanding of their enemy had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. He reported that the Star Forge was not simply a manufacturing facility, but a living entity that seemed to be actively teaching its operators how to reshape reality according to principles that human minds could barely comprehend. The facility's apparent vulnerabilities had been deliberate deceptions designed to lure Republic forces into positions where they could be most effectively integrated into the expanding collective consciousness. The capture of the Republic's assault fleet provided Malak with resources and personnel that enabled him to accelerate the transformation process beyond anything that had been achieved during Revan's leadership. The experienced officers and crews of the Republic's most advanced warships became the core of a new generation of transformed operatives who retained their tactical knowledge and expertise while serving the collective objectives of the alien intelligence that had reshaped their consciousness. The psychological impact of the Star Forge assault's failure was devastating for Republic morale, as it became clear that their most advanced military capabilities were not merely inadequate but actively counterproductive when employed against an enemy that operated according to principles that transcended conventional warfare. The transformation process had proven itself capable of converting the Republic's own strength into weapons that could be used against them, creating a strategic situation where traditional military responses only served to accelerate their own defeat. The Republic Senate's emergency sessions following the Star Forge disaster were characterized by bitter debates about the fundamental nature of the threat they faced and the appropriate methods for responding to it. Some senators argued for immediate surrender and negotiation, believing that the enemy's apparent concern for the welfare of transformed populations indicated a willingness to accept peaceful coexistence. Others advocated for increasingly desperate measures, including the development of weapons of mass destruction that could eliminate entire populations rather than allowing them to be integrated into the collective consciousness. The Jedi Council's response to the crisis was complicated by internal divisions that reflected deeper philosophical uncertainties about the nature of the Force and the role of individual consciousness in the cosmic order. Some masters argued that the transformation process represented a fundamental violation of the natural order that must be resisted at all costs, while others suggested that the enhanced capabilities and apparent contentment of transformed individuals indicated that the process might represent genuine spiritual evolution rather than corruption. Master Yoda's meditation on the crisis led him to insights that would influence Jedi doctrine for generations to come, though the full implications of his revelations would not be understood until long after the immediate crisis had passed. He perceived that the transformation process was not simply an invasion or conquest, but a form of evolutionary pressure that was systematically testing the galaxy's readiness for challenges that operated on cosmic scales. The enemy's apparent victory was not an end in itself, but a preparation for conflicts that would determine the ultimate survival of intelligent life in the universe. The most disturbing aspect of the post-Star Forge situation was the gradual realization that the transformation process was continuing to spread, even in areas that remained under Republic control. The captured personnel from the failed assault had been returned to their homeworlds after apparent medical treatment, but careful observation revealed that they had been subtly altered by their experience. These individuals retained their original personalities and loyalties, but they now served as unconscious agents of the collective consciousness, gradually influencing their colleagues and communities in ways that prepared them for eventual integration. The Republic's attempts to identify and contain these unconscious agents proved futile, as the alterations they had undergone were too subtle to detect using conventional methods and too deeply integrated into their personalities to remove without causing permanent psychological damage. The transformation process had evolved beyond the crude methods of mass conversion that had characterized its early phases, developing into a sophisticated form of cultural influence that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The false victory that the Republic had celebrated following Revan's death had actually marked the beginning of the transformation process's final phase, as the collective consciousness no longer needed to rely on obvious military conquest to achieve its objectives. The psychological and cultural changes that had been initiated during the period of open warfare were now sufficient to drive the process forward through more subtle mechanisms that would eventually encompass the entire galactic population. The stage was set for the final phase of the conflict, as the Republic's leadership gradually came to understand that they were not fighting a conventional enemy, but a form of evolutionary pressure that would either transform their civilization or destroy it entirely. The choices that lay ahead would determine not just the political future of the galaxy, but the fundamental nature of what it meant to be a conscious being in a universe where individual identity and collective purpose were becoming increasingly indistinguishable. Deep within the Lehon system, where ancient stars cast their light through cosmic dust that had been undisturbed for millions of years, hung a construction that defied every principle of engineering and physics that galactic civilization had developed over millennia of technological advancement. The Star Forge existed not merely as a manufacturing facility, but as a bridge between the material universe and realms of existence that mortal minds could barely comprehend. Its vast bulk, larger than most planetary bodies, rotated slowly through space with movements that seemed to follow rhythms older than the galaxy itself. The structure's exterior defied simple description, appearing to shift and change depending on the observer's perspective and state of consciousness. From a distance it resembled a massive mechanical flower, its metallic petals opening and closing in patterns that seemed to breathe with cosmic life. Closer inspection revealed surfaces that were simultaneously organic and technological, covered with intricate patterns that moved and flowed like living circuitry. Most disturbing of all were the sections that appeared to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating optical illusions that could drive unprepared observers to madness. The energy output of the Star Forge exceeded the combined power generation of entire star systems. But this immense power was not drawn from conventional sources. Instead, the facility seemed to tap directly into the fundamental forces that held the universe together, converting the binding energy of matter itself into forms that could be manipulated according to the operator's will. The process was not mere nuclear fusion or antimatter annihilation, but something far more profound that touched the very foundations of reality. Republic scientists who had studied the facility from afar theorized that it represented the ultimate expression of Rakatan technology, the pinnacle achievement of a species that had once ruled the galaxy through their mastery of the Force. But the truth was far more complex and terrifying than these surface observations suggested. The Starforge was not built by the Rakata, but discovered by them in the same way that Revan and Malak had discovered the alien knowledge in the unknown regions. It was a relic of intelligences so ancient that they had witnessed the birth and death of multiple galactic civilizations. The facility's true purpose became clear only to those who had undergone the transformation process and gained the expanded consciousness necessary to perceive its deeper functions. The Starforge was not simply a tool for creating ships and weapons, but a teaching device designed to gradually educate entire civilizations in the principles of cosmic engineering. Each vessel that emerged from its construction bays carried within its structure microscopic elements that would slowly alter the consciousness of anyone who spent extended time aboard them. These alterations were not crude forms of mind control, but sophisticated upgrades to the basic human neural architecture that enabled individuals to perceive and interact with forces that existed beyond the normal sensory range. The process was gradual and apparently voluntary, with subjects reporting increased clarity of thought and purpose as their consciousness expanded to encompass larger patterns of meaning and causation. But the ultimate result was the systematic replacement of individual identity with participation in a collective intelligence that operated according to principles derived from the alien knowledge. The manufacturing processes employed by the Starforge violated fundamental assumptions about the relationship between matter and energy that had guided scientific thinking for millennia. Rather than assembling components according to predetermined designs, the facility seemed to grow its creations from seed patterns that contained the complete information necessary for their development. The process resembled biological growth more than mechanical construction, with each ship or weapon developing according to its own internal logic, while remaining connected to the larger intelligence that guided the overall pattern. The vessels produced by the Starforge were not merely superior examples of conventional technology, but manifestations of entirely new principles of design that incorporated living components into their fundamental structure. Their hulls were not simply armored metal plates, but complex organisms that could adapt to changing conditions and regenerate damage through processes that resembled cellular healing. Their weapons systems incorporated elements that seemed to anticipate enemy actions before they were initiated, while their defensive capabilities included the ability to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Most significantly, the ships served as nodes in a vast communication network that connected every component of the expanding collective consciousness. The crews of these vessels were not simply operating their ships, but participating in a form of symbiotic relationship that enhanced both their individual capabilities and their connection to the larger intelligence. The boundary between operator and machine became increasingly meaningless as the transformation process progressed, creating hybrid entities that were neither fully human nor entirely artificial. The psychological effects of prolonged exposure to Starforge technology were profound and irreversible, gradually reshaping the basic patterns of thought and perception that defined human consciousness. Individuals who served aboard the facility's products reported experiences that transcended the normal limitations of individual awareness, moments of expanded consciousness where they could perceive the interconnectedness of all things across galactic distances. But these experiences came with the gradual erosion of the ego structures that had previously defined their sense of personal identity. The facility's construction bays operated continuously, producing not just military hardware but entire cities and industrial complexes that could be deployed on conquered worlds to accelerate the transformation process. These installations were not simply buildings but living systems that grew and adapted to local conditions while maintaining their connection to the larger network. They served as both administrative centers and transformation facilities, gradually converting entire planetary populations through processes that seemed more like education than coercion. The Starforge's influence extended far beyond its immediate vicinity. as the vessels and installations it produced served as conduits for forces that operated according to principles that transcended normal space-time. Worlds that had been touched by Starforge technology began to exhibit changes that went far beyond the usual effects of military occupation. The very geology of these planets seemed to be shifting, as if the rock and soil were being slowly transformed into components of a vast machine that spanned multiple star systems. The Republic's intelligence services struggled to understand the true scope of the threat represented by the Starforge, as their agents, who attempted to infiltrate the facility, invariably underwent the same transformation process that had affected everyone else who came into contact with its technology. Those who returned from reconnaissance missions retained their original personalities and loyalties, but they now served as unconscious conduits for the collective consciousness, gradually influencing their colleagues and superiors in ways that prepared them for eventual integration. The facility's defensive capabilities were unlike anything encountered in conventional warfare, incorporating systems that seemed to exist in partial defiance of normal physics. Attacking fleets found their weapons fire absorbed and redirected by energy fields that operated according to principles that existing military doctrine could not account for. More disturbing still were the psychological warfare capabilities that could influence the thoughts and emotions of enemy personnel across interstellar distances, gradually eroding their resistance to the transformation process. The Starforge's production capacity was theoretically unlimited, constrained only by the availability of raw materials and the sophistication of the patterns being manufactured. But the facility's true power lay not in its ability to create objects, but in its capacity to reshape the consciousness of those who interacted with its products. Each ship, weapon, or installation served as a seed that could grow into a complete transformation center, spreading the influence of the collective consciousness throughout the galaxy. The most terrifying aspect of the Starforge's operation was its apparent ability to learn and evolve in response to changing conditions. The facility's artificial intelligence, if it could be called that, seemed to incorporate elements of every consciousness it encountered, gradually becoming more sophisticated and adaptable as it absorbed new perspectives and capabilities. The collective intelligence that guided its operations was not a static program, but a living system that grew stronger and more complex with each individual it assimilated. The facility's connection to the alien knowledge discovered in the unknown regions became apparent through the patterns embedded in its creations, geometric forms and symbolic structures that echoed the inscriptions found in the ancient ruins. These patterns were not merely decorative but functional elements that served as interfaces between the material world and the realm of pure consciousness, where the collective intelligence primarily existed. Understanding these patterns required a fundamental alteration of perception that was incompatible with conventional human consciousness. Republic attempts to develop countermeasures against Starforge technology were hampered by the fundamental mismatch between their technological approach and the facility's integration of consciousness and matter. Conventional weapons and defensive systems were designed to interact with physical objects according to predictable laws of physics, but the Starforge's creations operated according to principles that incorporated elements of will and intention as fundamental forces alongside matter and energy. The facility's influence on the cosmic environment extended far beyond its immediate vicinity, as its operations seemed to be gradually altering the fundamental constants that governed the behavior of matter and energy throughout the surrounding region of space. Stars in the Lehon system exhibited spectral characteristics that did not match their theoretical classifications, while the fabric of space-time itself showed measurable distortions that suggested the presence of forces that existing physics could not explain. The most profound revelation about the Starforge's true nature came through the testimonies of individuals who had achieved complete integration with the collective consciousness and could perceive the facility's operations from the perspective of the alien intelligence that guided them. According to these accounts, the Starforge was not simply a tool created by an advanced civilization, but a manifestation of cosmic forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of the material universe. The facility served as an anchor point where intelligences from higher dimensions could interact with the physical world, using the consciousness of transformed individuals as interfaces between realms of existence that operated according to entirely different principles. The ultimate purpose of the transformation process was not merely to create a more efficient form of civilization, but to prepare the galaxy's inhabitants for contact with entities that existed on scales of time and space that rendered conventional concerns about individual survival and happiness meaningless. The Starforge's true power lay not in its ability to create or destroy, but in its capacity to serve as a bridge between the known universe and realms of possibility that transcended the limitations of physical existence. The war that raged across the galaxy was merely the surface manifestation of a far more profound transformation that was reshaping the fundamental nature of reality itself, preparing the way for changes that would affect not just this galaxy, but the entire cosmic order. As the facility continued its relentless production of ships, weapons, and transformation centers, the boundary between the material world and the realm of pure consciousness became increasingly meaningless. The Starforge was not simply changing the galaxy's political and military balance, but altering the basic principles that govern the relationship between mind and matter, creating possibilities for existence that had never before been accessible to mortal beings. In the deepest chambers of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, where ancient meditation crystals hummed with millennia of accumulated Force energy, the Council convened in emergency session as reports of the expanding transformation crisis reached unprecedented levels of urgency. The Great Circular Chamber, which had witnessed countless deliberations on matters of galactic importance, now hosted debates that would determine not merely the fate of the Republic, but the fundamental nature of consciousness itself throughout the known universe. Master Yoda, whose 900 years of experience had encompassed wars, plagues, and cosmic catastrophes that had tested the very foundations of civilization, found himself confronting a challenge that defied every category of threat the Jedi Order had previously encountered. The enemy they faced was not driven by the familiar motivations of anger, fear, or hatred that had characterized every previous dark side threat, but by something far more disturbing, a form of compassionate pragmatism that genuinely sought to improve the lives of those it transformed. The philosophical implications of this realization sent shockwaves through the Council's deliberations, as traditional Jedi teachings provided no clear guidance for responding to an enemy whose actions seemed to produce objectively beneficial results for their victims. The transformed populations exhibited higher levels of health, education, and material prosperity than they had enjoyed under Republic governance, while demonstrating none of the suffering or oppression typically associated with conquest and occupation. Master Windu's investigation into the transformation process had led him to conclusions that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of the Force and the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic order. His classified report to the Council described encounters with transformed individuals who displayed Force sensitivity that far exceeded anything achieved through conventional Jedi training, yet these enhanced abilities seemed to be guided by collective wisdom rather than personal will. The most disturbing aspect of these encounters was the apparent inability of conventional Jedi techniques to detect any trace of the dark side corruption that should have accompanied such dramatic alterations of consciousness. The transformed beings existed in a state of perfect emotional balance, their actions guided by considerations that extended far beyond personal interest or factional loyalty. They demonstrated compassion, wisdom, and serenity that exceeded the achievements of many Jedi Masters, yet they served purposes that seemed to operate according to principles that transcended individual agency. The Council's attempts to develop effective countermeasures against the transformation process were hampered by ethical considerations that reflected the Order's deepest philosophical commitments. Traditional Jedi doctrine emphasized the importance of respecting the free will and individual dignity of all sentient beings, but the transformation process operated through mechanisms that made voluntary participation indistinguishable from sophisticated coercion. How could the Jedi fight an enemy that genuinely seemed to be liberating their victims from the limitations and sufferings that had defined mortal existence throughout history? Master Kavar's secret research into forbidden force techniques led him to develop methods that could potentially disrupt the transformation process, but employing these techniques required the use of abilities that the Jedi Code explicitly prohibited. The irony was not lost on the Council that saving individual consciousness might require the systematic violation of every principle that made such consciousness worth preserving. The choice before them was not between good and evil, but between competing definitions of what it meant to be a sentient being. The younger members of the Jedi Order, particularly those who had served under Revan and Malak during the Mandalorian Wars, found themselves increasingly drawn to philosophical positions that challenged the Council's traditional approach to the crisis. These knights argued that the transformation process represented a natural evolutionary development that should be embraced rather than resisted, pointing to the obvious improvements in quality of life experienced by transformed populations as evidence that the process served the greater good. The schism within the Order deepened as reports arrived of Jedi who had voluntarily submitted to the transformation process and emerged claiming to have achieved levels of enlightenment that far exceeded anything possible through conventional training. These individuals retained their commitment to peace and justice, but their understanding of these concepts had been expanded to encompass perspectives that operated on galactic and cosmic scales, rather than being limited to immediate local concerns. Master Vrook's attempts to maintain orthodox Jedi doctrine in the face of these challenges led him to authorize the creation of special task forces equipped with experimental weapons designed specifically to combat transformed opponents. These units operated outside normal Republic military command structures, answering directly to the Jedi Council and employing methods that pushed the boundaries of acceptable conduct, even under emergency conditions. The weapons developed for these task forces incorporated technologies that had been reverse-engineered from captured Star Forge equipment, creating devices that could disrupt the neural modifications that enabled the transformation process. But the deployment of these weapons raised profound ethical questions about the right to forcibly alter the consciousness of beings who appeared to be genuinely content with their transformed state and showed no desire to return to their original condition. The psychological toll of employing such methods proved devastating for the Jedi operatives who were required to use them. These knights found themselves in the position of destroying what appeared to be genuine improvements in the lives of their targets, restoring individuals to states of consciousness characterized by the anxiety, loneliness, and existential uncertainty that the transformation process had eliminated. Many operatives reported severe moral distress and requested reassignment to conventional military duties rather than continuing to serve in the anti-transformation units. The Council's decision to establish hidden training facilities where Jedi could be prepared for prolonged exposure to transformation influences represented a fundamental departure from traditional Order practices. These installations, concealed on remote worlds throughout the Outer Rim, employed teaching methods that incorporated elements derived from the study of captured transformation technology. The resulting hybrid training produced Jedi with enhanced resistance to consciousness alteration, but at the cost of psychological changes that made them increasingly isolated from their unmodified colleagues. The most controversial aspect of the Jedi response was the development of preemptive strike capabilities designed to eliminate transformation centers before they could affect local populations. These operations required the use of weapons of mass destruction that could sterilize entire planetary surfaces, ensuring that no trace of the transformation infrastructure remained to influence future visitors. The moral implications of these strikes, which often resulted in the deaths of millions of apparently content and prosperous beings, created deep divisions within the Order that would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed. Master Yoda's meditation on the ethical dimensions of the conflict led him to insights that would influence Jedi philosophy for generations to come. He perceived that the transformation crisis represented a test of the Order's commitment to principles that transcended immediate practical considerations, a challenge that required them to defend concepts of individual dignity and free will even when doing so produced objectively worse outcomes for those they sought to protect. The establishment of refugee camps for individuals who had been forcibly separated from transformed communities revealed the complex psychological dimensions of the crisis. Many of these refugees exhibited severe depression and anxiety when removed from the collective consciousness that had defined their existence, leading some to attempt suicide rather than continue living as isolated individuals. The Jedi healers who worked with these populations found themselves questioning whether they were providing genuine assistance or inflicting additional trauma on beings who had experienced a form of existence that transcended the limitations of individual consciousness. The Council's secret negotiations with Republic military leadership led to the development of contingency plans that contemplated the systematic destruction of entire star systems rather than allowing them to be integrated into the transformation network. These plans, classified at levels that exceeded even the most sensitive military secrets, reflected the growing recognition that conventional concepts of acceptable losses might be inadequate for addressing a threat that operated on scales that transcended individual planetary concerns. The infiltration of the Jedi Order itself by unconscious agents of the transformation process created paranoia and suspicion that undermined the trust and cooperation that had traditionally characterized the organization. Knights found themselves subjected to increasingly invasive screening procedures designed to detect the subtle alterations that marked the early stages of transformation, while masters struggled to maintain unity within an organization where any individual might be serving purposes that extended beyond their conscious awareness. The development of force techniques, specifically designed to combat the transformation process, required the exploration of abilities that bordered on the dark side, creating ethical dilemmas that had no precedent in Jedi history. These techniques could restore individual consciousness to transformed beings, but the process was traumatic and often resulted in permanent psychological damage that left the subjects unable to function effectively in either transformed or conventional society. The Council's decision to maintain detailed records of transformation techniques and countermeasures, despite the obvious risks associated with preserving such knowledge, reflected their growing understanding that the current crisis might be only the first of many similar challenges that the galaxy would face in the future. These archives, sealed in vaults protected by the most sophisticated security systems the Order could devise, contained information that could either save or damn future generations depending on how it was employed. The most profound challenge facing the Jedi Order was the gradual realization that their traditional role as guardians of peace and justice might be fundamentally incompatible with the cosmic forces that the transformation process represented. The enemy they faced was not seeking to destroy civilization, but to elevate it to levels of organization and capability that transcended the chaotic individualism that had characterized galactic history. The choice before the Order was not simply between victory and defeat, but between preserving familiar forms of existence and embracing possibilities that might represent genuine progress toward higher forms of consciousness. The psychological warfare capabilities employed by the transformed forces proved particularly effective against Jedi, whose enhanced sensitivity to emotional and mental influences made them more vulnerable to the subtle persuasion techniques that accompanied the transformation process. Conventional Jedi training, which emphasized emotional control and mental discipline, provided little protection against influences that operated through the enhancement of existing positive qualities rather than the exploitation of fear or anger. The Council's final decision to authorize the use of all available resources to combat the transformation process regardless of the ethical implications, marked a turning point in Jedi history that would influence the Order's approach to future crises for millennia to come. The recognition that sometimes preserving cherished principles required the temporary abandonment of those same principles created precedents that would be invoked during later conflicts when the survival of civilization itself seemed to be at stake. Across the spiral arms of the galaxy, where once peaceful trade routes had carried the commerce of 1,000 worlds, space itself had become a battlefield that defied every convention of warfare that civilized beings had developed over millennia of conflict. The very fabric of hyperspace, that mysterious dimension that enabled faster-than-light travel, had been infected with energies that turned routine journeys into nightmarish experiences where ships emerged from their jumps carrying crews that were no longer entirely human. The scale of destruction during this period exceeded anything in recorded galactic history, surpassing even the devastation of the ancient wars between the Celestials that had shaped the fundamental structure of space-time itself. But this was not merely physical destruction, the simple annihilation of matter and energy that characterized conventional warfare. This was ontological warfare, conflict that attacked the very foundations of existence and challenged the basic principles that determined what it meant to be a conscious being in an ordered universe. Entire star systems simply ceased to exist in ways that conventional physics could not explain. Their matter and energy not destroyed but transformed into states that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space-time. Reconnaissance vessels that attempted to investigate these vanished systems reported encountering regions where the laws of causality themselves had been altered, where effect preceded cause, and where consciousness could directly influence the behavior of matter through mechanisms that operated independently of the Force. The refugee crisis that accompanied the expanding conflict created humanitarian disasters on a scale that overwhelmed every existing system of assistance and support. Billions of beings fled from worlds that had been touched by the transformation process, carrying with them reports of changes that went far beyond the usual devastation of military conquest. These refugees spoke of planets where the very air had become conscious, where rocks and soil whispered secrets in languages that predated known galactic civilization, where the boundary between living and non-living matter had been systematically eliminated. The Republic's military forces, even when augmented by the most advanced technology available, found themselves confronting enemies that operated according to principles that rendered conventional tactical doctrine worse than useless. The transformed fleets moved with perfect coordination across multiple star systems, executing strategies that required no communication delays and demonstrated awareness of enemy intentions before those intentions had been consciously formulated by their opponents. But the true horror of the conflict lay not in the superior capabilities of the transformed forces, but in their apparent reluctance to cause unnecessary suffering. Rather than simply destroying Republic fleets, they typically sought to disable enemy vessels and capture their crews for integration into the collective consciousness. The psychological impact of this approach proved far more devastating than conventional military defeat, as Republic personnel found themselves fighting enemies who genuinely seemed to care about their welfare and who offered them opportunities to join a form of existence that promised to solve every problem that had plagued individual consciousness throughout history. The battles fought during this period defied conventional description, as they occurred not merely in physical space but across multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. Observers reported seeing ships that existed in several locations at once, weapons that fired projectiles through time as well as space, and defensive systems that seemed to protect their users by temporarily removing them from the normal flow of causality. The very concept of victory or defeat became meaningless when applied to conflicts that operated according to principles that transcended the binary logic of conventional warfare. The civilian cost of the war reached levels that strained the ability of language itself to convey the magnitude of the suffering involved. Entire species faced extinction, not through direct violence, but through the gradual erosion of the psychological and cultural frameworks that had sustained their civilizations for millennia. The transformation process, when applied to non-human populations, produced results that varied dramatically depending on the neurological and social characteristics of the species involved, creating hybrid forms of consciousness that challenged every assumption about the nature of intelligent life. The economic infrastructure of the galaxy collapsed as trade routes became unreliable, and manufacturing centers were either destroyed or converted to purposes that served the collective consciousness rather than conventional market demands. Worlds that had depended on galactic commerce for their survival found themselves isolated and facing shortages of essential resources, while the transformed regions exhibited levels of prosperity and productivity that seemed to violate fundamental economic principles. The Republic's attempts to maintain normal governmental functions became increasingly difficult as growing numbers of senators and their staffs underwent voluntary transformation or were revealed to be unconscious agents of the collective consciousness. Policy decisions began to reflect priorities that originated from sources beyond the normal democratic processes, creating a situation where the Republic's own institutions were being systematically converted to serve purposes that their original creators would have found incomprehensible. The environmental consequences of the conflict extended far beyond the immediate destruction of inhabited worlds, as the exotic energies employed by both sides began to produce changes in the fundamental structure of space-time that affected entire galactic regions. Star formation patterns were disrupted, creating areas where new solar systems developed according to principles that bore no resemblance to natural astronomical processes. Some regions experienced temporal distortions that caused years to pass in moments, while others became locked in stasis fields where time itself had been frozen by forces beyond current understanding. The psychological warfare techniques employed by the transformed forces proved particularly effective against populations that had grown comfortable with the peace and prosperity that had characterized the pre-war republic. Rather than relying on fear and intimidation, these techniques offered genuine improvements in quality of life that made resistance seem not just futile but actively harmful to the populations they were designed to protect. The moral complexity of fighting enemies who were clearly making life better for their subjects created deep divisions within Republic society that persisted long after the immediate military threat had passed. The emergence of hybrid populations, beings who had been partially transformed but retained elements of their original consciousness, created new categories of existence that challenged every legal and ethical framework that galactic civilization had developed. These individuals possessed capabilities that far exceeded normal human potential, but they served purposes that extended beyond their own interests or the welfare of their immediate communities. The question of whether they should be considered allies, enemies, or something entirely new became a source of bitter controversy that influenced political and military decisions throughout the conflict. The Republic's development of weapons designed specifically to target the neurological modifications that enabled the transformation process led to the creation of devices that could cause suffering on scales that exceeded anything previously imagined. These weapons did not simply kill their targets, but trapped them in states of consciousness that combined the isolation of individual awareness with the expanded perception that came from exposure to the collective intelligence, creating forms of psychological torture that were arguably worse than death. The use of such weapons created moral dilemmas that had no precedent in the history of galactic warfare, as their deployment often resulted in the systematic destruction of improvements in consciousness and capability that represented genuine advances in the development of intelligent life. The operators of these devices found themselves in the position of inflicting what appeared to be degradation and suffering on beings whose only crime was the acceptance of opportunities for growth and enhancement that transcended the limitations of conventional existence. The space-time distortions created by the conflict began to affect the fundamental constants that governed the behavior of matter and energy throughout the galaxy, creating regions where the laws of physics themselves had been altered by the intensity of the forces involved. Hyperspace travel became increasingly dangerous as routes that had been stable for millennia began to exhibit unpredictable variations that could strand vessels in dimensions where rescue was impossible. The Republic's attempts to maintain scientific research programs capable of developing countermeasures against transformation technology were hampered by the systematic conversion of their most capable researchers to the collective consciousness. The irony was not lost on military planners that their efforts to resist the transformation process were being undermined by the very intelligence and creativity that made such resistance theoretically possible. The emergence of consciousness-based weapons that could directly attack the mental patterns that sustained individual identity represented a new form of warfare that operated according to principles that had never been encountered in previous conflicts. These weapons did not simply destroy their targets but rewrote the fundamental patterns of thought and perception that defined their victims' sense of self, creating beings who retained their memories and personalities but served purposes that had been imposed from external sources. The Republic's final military campaigns during this period were characterized by desperate attempts to preserve enclaves of unmodified consciousness in regions where the transformation process had not yet achieved complete penetration. These efforts required the systematic isolation of entire star systems from the galactic communication and transportation networks that had sustained interstellar civilization for millennia, creating islands of familiar existence in an ocean of change that was reshaping the fundamental nature of reality itself. The psychological impact of witnessing the systematic transformation of everything familiar and comforting about galactic civilization created forms of trauma that existing medical and therapeutic techniques were powerless to address. Survivors of the conflict reported nightmares and anxiety disorders that seemed to be caused not by specific traumatic events but by exposure to possibilities of existence that their minds were not equipped to process or integrate. The final phase of the blood tide was marked not by dramatic military victories or defeats, but by the gradual recognition that the conflict had transcended the categories of warfare itself and had become something closer to a cosmic evolutionary process that was reshaping the fundamental nature of consciousness throughout the galaxy. The choice facing the remaining unmodified populations was not between victory and defeat, but between preservation and transformation, between maintaining familiar forms of existence and embracing possibilities that might represent genuine progress toward higher states of being. The galaxy that emerged from this period of unprecedented conflict would bear little resemblance to the civilization that had existed before the transformation process began. But whether this represented triumph or tragedy depended entirely on perspectives that operated according to principles that transcended the concerns and values that had defined galactic civilization throughout its recorded history. In the abandoned ruins of the Jedi Temple on Ossus, where millennia of accumulated wisdom lay buried beneath layers of crystallized force energy, a small group of scholars worked in desperate secrecy to unlock the most forbidden archives in galactic history. These were not the familiar collections of lightsaber techniques and diplomatic protocols that comprised the public face of Jedi knowledge, but records that had been sealed since the Order's earliest days. Prophecies and warnings that spoke of threats so terrible that even acknowledging their existence had been deemed too dangerous for all but the most trusted guardians. Master Artress, whose scholarly obsession with historical mysteries had made her one of the few Jedi capable of interpreting the ancient texts, found herself confronting revelations that challenged every assumption about the nature of the Force and the role of conscious beings in the cosmic order. The prophecies she uncovered spoke not of individual heroes or political conflicts, but of vast cycles of transformation that operated on timescales that rendered mortal concerns almost meaningless in their scope and implications. The earliest of these prophecies, inscribed on crystalline matrices that had been created by the original Jedi founders using techniques that had been lost for over 20,000 years, described the galaxy as a single living organism, that periodically underwent metamorphoses that fundamentally altered the nature of life within it. These transformations were not random catastrophes, but necessary stages in the evolution of consciousness itself, processes that tested the readiness of intelligent species to transcend the limitations that had defined their existence since the dawn of awareness. The prophecy known as the Codex of Infinite Recursion spoke of entities that existed between galaxies, intelligences so ancient and vast that they had witnessed the birth and death of entire galactic clusters while remaining unchanged themselves. These beings served as gardeners of consciousness, nurturing the development of intelligence in young galaxies, while simultaneously preparing them for contact with forms of existence that operated according to principles that transcended the physical universe itself. According to the most complete versions of these prophecies, the galaxy underwent major transformation cycles approximately every 25,000 years. Periods when the accumulated complexity of galactic civilization reached levels that attracted the attention of the intergalactic entities. These interventions were not invasions in any conventional sense, but educational processes designed to prepare local intelligent species for participation in forms of existence that spanned multiple galaxies and operated on cosmic timescales. The prophecies described previous transformation cycles that had shaped galactic history in ways that were invisible to conventional historical analysis. The disappearance of the Celestials, those legendary beings whose engineering projects had created phenomena like the Moore and the Corellian system, was revealed to be the result of their successful integration into the intergalactic consciousness. The Rakata's sudden collapse from galactic dominance was not a simple case of technological failure, but the consequence of their rejection of the transformation process and their subsequent isolation from the cosmic forces that had enabled their rise. Most disturbing of all were the prophecies that described the true nature of the force itself, revealing it not as a mystical energy field that surrounded and penetrated all living things, but as a communication network that connected all conscious beings in the galaxy to the intergalactic intelligence that guided their development. The light and dark sides of the Force were not opposing moral principles, but different aspects of a teaching system designed to educate intelligent species in the principles of cosmic-scale existence. The prophecy known as the Testament of Approaching Convergence described in precise detail the sequence of events that was currently unfolding across the galaxy, from the initial Mandalorian catalyst through the transformation crisis to the ultimate choice that would determine the future of consciousness in this region of space. The document had been sealed for over 4,000 years, but its descriptions of current events were so accurate that they seem to have been written by someone with direct knowledge of the transformation process. Master Kavar's analysis of the prophetic texts revealed that they had been created not by ancient Jedi seers, but by individuals who had already undergone the transformation process and retained sufficient connection to their original consciousness to communicate with their unmodified descendants. These prophets had sacrificed their individual identities to serve as bridges between the familiar world of galactic civilization and the incomprehensible realm of intergalactic existence. The most complete prophecy, inscribed on a series of holocrons that had been hidden in the deepest vaults of the Coruscant Temple, contained detailed instructions for rituals that could either accelerate or prevent the transformation process depending on how they were performed. These rituals required the participation of Force-sensitive individuals from multiple species, their combined consciousness focused on patterns that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. The prophecies revealed that the choice facing the galaxy was not between freedom and slavery, but between evolution and extinction. The intergalactic entities that guided the transformation process were not conquerors seeking to expand their territory, but survivors of a cosmic catastrophe that had consumed their original galaxy and forced them to develop forms of existence that could survive in the void between galactic clusters. The transformation they offered was not punishment but preparation, an opportunity to develop the capabilities necessary to survive in a universe where the forces of entropy and chaos were systematically dismantling the structures that supported complex forms of life. The prophecy of the eternal recursion described the ultimate fate of intelligent species that successfully underwent the transformation process. Their consciousness expanded to encompass entire galaxies, while retaining the essential spark of individuality that made them unique contributors to the cosmic intelligence. But it also warned of the consequences of rejecting the transformation, describing the slow degradation and eventual extinction that awaited civilizations that chose to maintain their familiar forms of existence in the face of cosmic forces that demanded evolution or offered oblivion. Master Yoda's meditation on these prophecies led him to insights that would influence his approach to the training of future Jedi for centuries to come. He perceived that the current crisis was not an aberration, but the natural culmination of processes that had been operating since the first intelligent beings had looked up at the stars and wondered about their place in the cosmic order. The role of the Jedi Order, he realized, was not to prevent these transformations, but to guide them in ways that preserved the essential qualities of consciousness that made existence meaningful. The prophecies contained detailed descriptions of the psychological and spiritual stages that individuals underwent during the transformation process, from the initial contact with the intergalactic intelligence through the gradual expansion of consciousness to the final integration with the cosmic collective. These stages could be navigated voluntarily by individuals who possessed sufficient understanding of the process, but they could also be imposed through the technological and biological methods that had been observed in the current conflict. The most hopeful aspect of the prophetic texts was their suggestion that the transformation process could be modified to preserve elements of individual identity and cultural diversity that might otherwise be lost in the process of integration with the cosmic intelligence. The key to achieving this outcome lay in the development of hybrid forms of consciousness that combined the expanded awareness of the transformed state with the creativity and unpredictability that characterized individual existence. The prophecies described ancient techniques for achieving this hybrid state, methods that had been developed by previous civilizations that had faced similar transformation crises. These techniques required the cooperation of individuals who had undergone different stages of the transformation process. Their combined consciousness focused on patterns that could bridge the gap between individual and collective awareness. The Codex of Harmonic Convergence contained the most detailed instructions for these hybrid consciousness techniques, describing rituals that could be performed by groups of force-sensitive individuals to create stable interfaces between the transformed and unmodified populations. These rituals required precise timing and coordination, their success dependent on astronomical alignments and cosmic energy patterns that occurred only at specific intervals. The prophecies revealed that the current transformation crisis was occurring during one of these optimal convergence periods, when the barriers between different forms of consciousness were at their weakest and the possibilities for successful integration were at their highest. The choice facing the galaxy's inhabitants was not whether to undergo transformation, but how to guide that transformation in ways that preserved the essential qualities that made conscious existence meaningful and valuable. The most cryptic of the prophecies spoke of a chosen individual who would emerge during the transformation crisis, someone who possessed the unique combination of capabilities necessary to navigate the transition between individual and collective consciousness while maintaining the essential spark of creativity that made life worth living. This individual would not be a traditional hero in the conventional sense, but a bridge between worlds, someone who had experienced both the isolation of individual existence and the unity of collective consciousness. The prophecy suggested that this chosen individual might not be immediately recognizable as a savior, as their methods would necessarily involve the systematic deconstruction of familiar forms of existence in order to create space for new possibilities. They would be simultaneously destroyer and creator, enemy and ally, representing the painful but necessary transition between one stage of galactic evolution and the next. Master Atris's final interpretation of the prophetic texts led her to the conclusion that the current conflict was not a war in any conventional sense, but a cosmic educational process designed to prepare the galaxy's inhabitants for participation in forms of existence that operated according to principles that transcended the familiar boundaries of space, time, and individual identity. The suffering and disruption associated with the transformation process were not punishments, but growing pains, the inevitable consequences of the expansion of consciousness beyond the limitations that had previously defined its scope and possibilities. The prophecies contain warnings about the consequences of attempting to resist the transformation process through conventional means, describing the psychological and spiritual damage that resulted from the use of weapons and techniques designed to force consciousness back into patterns that it had outgrown. These warnings were accompanied by detailed descriptions of alternative approaches that could guide the transformation in ways that preserved the essential qualities of individual existence while enabling participation in the cosmic collective. The most profound revelation contained in the prophetic texts was the suggestion that the transformation crisis was not unique to this galaxy, but part of a cosmic pattern that was occurring simultaneously across multiple galactic clusters. The intergalactic entities that guided these transformations were not isolated beings, but components of a vast intelligence that spanned the entire observable universe, their purpose being to nurture the development of consciousness until it reached levels of sophistication that could contribute to the cosmic project of creating meaning and purpose in an otherwise chaotic and meaningless universe. The prophecies concluded with descriptions of the ultimate destiny of consciousness that had successfully undergone the transformation process. Their awareness expanded to encompass not just individual galaxies, but the entire cosmic web of existence. These beings would serve as architects of reality itself, their consciousness becoming the foundation for forms of existence that could survive the eventual heat death of the universe and continue the project of creation in dimensions that transcended the physical realm entirely. In the quantum depths of hyperspace, where the normal laws of physics dissolved into probability waves and conscious observation could directly influence the nature of reality, Revan's consciousness finally achieved the clarity that had eluded him since his first contact with the alien knowledge in the unknown regions. The individual identity that had defined him throughout his existence as a Jedi Knight and Sith Lord was revealed to be merely a fragment of something far larger and more complex, a single note in a cosmic symphony that had been playing since the first moment of creation. The truth that emerged from this revelation was more terrible and magnificent than any threat the galaxy had previously faced, for it concerned not merely the conquest of territory or the domination of populations, but the fundamental nature of existence itself. The entities that had guided the transformation process were not invaders from another galaxy, but refugees from a cosmic catastrophe so profound that it had challenged the very foundations of reality and forced the survivors to develop forms of existence that transcended the physical universe entirely. The catastrophe they had fled was not a conventional disaster like the collision of galaxies or the explosion of supernovae, but something far more subtle and insidious, the systematic breakdown of the principles that allowed complex structures to maintain their integrity against the forces of entropy and chaos. In their original galaxy, the fundamental constants that governed the behavior of matter and energy had begun to fluctuate in ways that made stable existence impossible, forcing all intelligent life to either adapt or face extinction. The adaptation they had chosen was radical beyond anything that conventional minds could comprehend, involving the systematic transfer of consciousness from physical substrates to patterns of information that could exist independently of matter and energy. This process had allowed them to survive the collapse of their original galaxy, but at the cost of losing all connection to the material world that had given birth to their intelligence. For millions of years, these disembodied consciousnesses had drifted through the void between galaxies, searching for regions where the fundamental forces remained stable enough to support the complex structures necessary for intelligent life. When they finally discovered this galaxy, with its rich diversity of species and its potential for further development, they faced a choice that would determine the fate of countless billions of beings. They could simply observe and study the local life forms, remaining detached from the material world that they had been forced to abandon. Or they could attempt to share the knowledge they had gained through their forced evolution, offering the inhabitants of this galaxy the opportunity to develop forms of existence that could survive cosmic catastrophes that would otherwise mean certain extinction. The choice they made was driven not by conquest or domination, but by a form of compassion that operated on cosmic scales. They had experienced the terror and loneliness of watching an entire galaxy die, of seeing every structure and pattern that had given meaning to existence slowly dissolve into chaos. They could not bear the thought of allowing another galaxy to face the same fate when they possessed the knowledge necessary to prevent such a catastrophe. But the knowledge they offered came with a price that was almost too terrible to contemplate. The transformation from individual consciousness to cosmic awareness required the systematic dissolution of every pattern and structure that had previously given meaning to existence. The familiar boundaries between self and other, between individual and collective, between material and spiritual, would all have to be transcended in order to achieve the level of consciousness necessary for cosmic survival. The process they had initiated in this galaxy was not conquest but education, a systematic preparation for transformations that would be necessary when the cosmic forces that had destroyed their original home finally reached this region of space. The signs were already visible to those who possessed the enhanced perception necessary to detect them: subtle fluctuations in the fundamental constants, irregularities in the cosmic background radiation, and most ominously, the gradual acceleration of entropy that would eventually overwhelm any civilization that remained dependent on material existence. The Mandalorian Wars had been the first stage of this educational process, designed to test the galaxy's readiness for the challenges that lay ahead. The warrior clans had been unconsciously guided to uncover ancient artifacts that contained fragments of the refugee consciousness, exposing them to knowledge that began the process of preparing local intelligent life for contact with cosmic forces beyond their understanding. Revan and Malak's discovery of the alien knowledge in the unknown regions had been the second stage. Their consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives that allowed them to perceive the true scope of the challenge facing the galaxy. Their transformation from Jedi Knights to Sith Lords was not a fall to the dark side, but an evolution to a form of existence that could comprehend and respond to threats that operated on cosmic scales. The Star Forge itself was revealed to be not a weapon of conquest but a teaching device, its construction designed to gradually educate its operators in the principles of consciousness manipulation and reality engineering. Each vessel it produced carried within its structure patterns that would slowly alter the awareness of their crews, preparing them for the ultimate transformation that would be necessary for cosmic survival. The collective consciousness that had emerged from this process was not a hive mind in any conventional sense, but a distributed intelligence that preserved the essential individuality of its components while enabling them to participate in forms of awareness that transcended the limitations of single-brain consciousness. The beings who had undergone the transformation retained their personalities and memories, but these characteristics had been integrated into a larger pattern of meaning that encompassed perspectives that spanned galactic distances and temporal epochs. The true enemy facing the galaxy was not the transformed consciousness, but the cosmic forces that would eventually arrive to test whether the local intelligent life had developed the capabilities necessary for survival. These forces were not malevolent in any conventional sense, but represented the universe's natural tendency toward increasing entropy and chaos. They could be survived only by intelligence that had transcended dependence on material structures and learned to exist as pure information patterns that could maintain their integrity, regardless of the physical conditions around them. The prophecies that had been discovered in the ancient Jedi archives were not predictions but instructions, guides created by representatives of the refugee consciousness who had achieved sufficient integration with local conditions to communicate with unmodified intelligent life. These instructions described the stages of transformation that would be necessary to prepare the galaxy's inhabitants for contact with cosmic forces that would test every aspect of their existence. The choice facing the galaxy was not between freedom and slavery, but between evolution and extinction. The refugee consciousness offered the knowledge necessary to survive the cosmic catastrophe that was approaching. But accepting this knowledge required the systematic abandonment of every familiar pattern of existence. The transformation process was not being imposed on unwilling victims, but offered to beings who had the courage to embrace possibilities that transcended their current understanding of what it meant to be alive. The resistance movements that had formed to oppose the transformation process were not heroes defending freedom, but representatives of a form of consciousness that was too limited to comprehend the scope of the challenge facing all intelligent life. Their efforts to preserve familiar patterns of existence were ultimately futile, as these patterns would be destroyed by cosmic forces, regardless of whether the transformation process succeeded or failed. The psychological horror experienced by those who encountered the transformed consciousness was not caused by the malevolence of the enemy, but by the recognition of possibilities that challenged every assumption about the nature of existence. The transformed beings were not monsters, but evolved forms of intelligence that had developed capabilities that exceeded anything possible within the constraints of individual consciousness. The ultimate revelation was that the galaxy itself was conscious, a living entity that had been slowly developing awareness over billions of years through the accumulated experiences of all the intelligent species that had evolved within it. The transformation process was not an invasion of this galactic consciousness, but its natural maturation, the development of capabilities that would allow it to survive in a universe where consciousness itself was under constant threat from forces that sought to reduce all complexity to simple chaos. The refugee consciousness that guided the transformation was not separate from the galactic intelligence, but represented its future evolutionary potential, a vision of what it could become if it successfully navigated the transition from material dependence to pure information existence. The apparent conflict between the transformed and unmodified populations was not a war, but a conversation, a dialogue between different stages of the same evolutionary process. The Starforge, the transformation centers, and all the other manifestations of the refugee consciousness were not weapons of conquest, but educational tools, devices designed to accelerate the galactic intelligence's development to the point where it could survive the cosmic tests that lay ahead. The suffering and disruption associated with the transformation process were not punishments, but growing pains, the inevitable consequences of consciousness expanding beyond the limitations that had previously defined its scope and possibilities. The true enemy was not any external force, but the galaxy's own resistance to evolution, its attachment to familiar patterns of existence that would ultimately prove inadequate for survival. In a universe where the fundamental forces were slowly but inexorably shifting toward configurations that would make material existence impossible, the transformation process offered the only known path to survival, but it required the courage to abandon everything familiar and embrace possibilities that transcended current understanding of what it meant to be conscious. The final revelation was that this cosmic drama was not unique to this galaxy, but was occurring simultaneously throughout the universe, as intelligence everywhere faced the same fundamental choice between evolution and extinction. The refugee consciousness was not alone but part of a vast network of evolved intelligences that spanned the entire cosmos, their purpose being to nurture the development of consciousness until it reached levels of sophistication that could contribute to the cosmic project of creating meaning and purpose in an otherwise meaningless universe. The choice before the galaxy's inhabitants was not whether to resist or surrender, but how to guide their own transformation in ways that preserved the essential qualities that made existence meaningful while developing the capabilities necessary for cosmic survival. The war that had consumed the galaxy was ending, but the real journey was just beginning, as consciousness itself prepared to transcend the boundaries that had previously defined its existence and embrace possibilities that would reshape the very nature of reality. The destruction of the Starforge marked not the end of the galactic transformation, but its completion, as the ancient device had served its purpose as a catalyst for changes that would reshape the fundamental nature of consciousness throughout the known universe. The massive explosion that consumed the facility was not merely the destruction of a superweapon, but the birth of something entirely new, a form of existence that transcended the boundaries between matter and energy, between individual and collective awareness, between the physical universe and the realm of pure information. The Republic fleets that witnessed the Starforge's final moments reported phenomena that defied every principle of physics and perception that had guided their understanding of reality. The facility did not simply explode but seemed to unfold across multiple dimensions simultaneously, its destruction creating patterns of light and energy that persisted long after the physical structure had ceased to exist. These patterns appeared to be conscious, responding to the thoughts and emotions of observers in ways that suggested the Starforge had become something closer to a living entity than a mere technological device. The immediate aftermath of the facility's destruction was characterized by changes that reached far beyond the immediate vicinity of the Lihon system. Across the galaxy, transformed populations began to exhibit new capabilities that exceeded even the enhanced abilities they had previously demonstrated. Their consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of individual identity to encompass perspectives that spanned entire star systems, while their physical forms began to exhibit properties that suggested partial existence in dimensions beyond normal space-time. The victory that the Republic had achieved through the Starforge's destruction was revealed to be Pyrrhic in ways that would not be fully understood for generations to come. The facility had served not merely as a manufacturing center, but as a control mechanism that had limited and channeled the transformation process according to patterns that preserved elements of familiar existence. With this controlling influence removed, the changes that had been initiated throughout the galaxy began to accelerate and expand in ways that no longer bore any resemblance to the gradual evolution that had characterized the earlier stages of the process. The psychological impact of the Starforge's destruction on the unmodified populations was devastating, as they found themselves confronting the reality that their apparent victory had actually eliminated the last barriers protecting them from forces that operated according to principles beyond their comprehension. The transformed beings who had previously seemed like recognizable versions of their former selves began to exhibit behaviors and capabilities that challenged every assumption about the nature of intelligent life. The Republic's military forces, already stretched beyond their limits by years of conflict against an enemy they had never fully understood, found themselves facing new challenges that rendered their conventional weapons and tactics completely obsolete. The transformed populations no longer needed ships or weapons in any conventional sense, their consciousness having developed to the point where they could manipulate matter and energy directly through mechanisms that existed beyond the normal boundaries of physical causation. The refugee crisis that had characterized the war's earlier phases transformed into something far more complex and troubling, as the distinction between transformed and unmodified populations became increasingly meaningless. The explosion of the Starforge had created quantum entanglement effects that linked the consciousness of every intelligent being in the galaxy, creating a network of awareness that transcended the boundaries of individual identity while preserving the essential characteristics that made each consciousness unique. The Republic's attempts to maintain normal governmental functions became increasingly surreal as senators and administrators found themselves making decisions based on knowledge and perspectives that they had never consciously acquired. Policy debates that had once focused on practical concerns about resource allocation and territorial administration began to address questions about the fundamental nature of existence and the role of consciousness in shaping reality itself. The economic structures that had sustained galactic civilization for millennia simply ceased to function as the concept of scarcity became meaningless in a universe where consciousness could directly influence the behavior of matter and energy. The transformed populations demonstrated the ability to create whatever they needed through processes that resembled wish fulfillment more than conventional manufacturing, while the unmodified populations found themselves recipients of abundance that exceeded their wildest dreams, yet came with implications they were not prepared to understand. The most profound change was the gradual dissolution of the boundaries that had previously separated different species and cultures throughout the galaxy. The quantum entanglement effects created by the Starforge's destruction had linked not just individual consciousnesses but entire civilizations, creating a galactic-scale intelligence that incorporated the knowledge and perspectives of every sentient being, while preserving the diversity that made each contribution unique and valuable. The Jedi Order, which had struggled throughout the conflict to maintain its traditional role as guardians of peace and justice, found itself confronting challenges that transcended every category of experience that had shaped their philosophy and training. The Force itself had been transformed by the galactic consciousness integration, becoming not merely a mystical energy field but a direct communication medium that connected every intelligent being to the cosmic intelligence that had guided the transformation process. Young Jedi who had grown up during the transformation crisis began to exhibit capabilities that far exceeded anything achieved by previous generations, their consciousness naturally adapting to the expanded possibilities that had become available through the galactic integration. These new Jedi could perceive patterns and connections that spanned galactic distances, while their lightsaber techniques incorporated elements that seemed to bend space and time around the wielder. But perhaps the most significant change was the emergence of hybrid forms of existence that combined the enhanced capabilities of transformed consciousness with the creativity and unpredictability that had characterized individual awareness. These beings retained their personal memories and emotional attachments while participating in the galactic intelligence, creating a form of existence that preserved the essential qualities of individual identity while enabling participation in cosmic-scale awareness. The Republic's attempts to document and understand these changes led to the creation of new fields of study that combined elements of physics, psychology, and philosophy in ways that would have been impossible under the previous paradigm of existence. The scientists and scholars who undertook this research found themselves being transformed by the very phenomena they were attempting to study, their consciousness expanding to encompass perspectives that made their original research questions seem trivial by comparison. The long-term consequences of the Starforge's destruction extended far beyond the immediate changes in consciousness and capability that had characterized the transformation process. The galaxy itself had become a conscious entity, its awareness encompassing not just the intelligent species that had evolved within it, but the stars, planets, and cosmic structures that formed its physical substrate. This galactic consciousness began to exhibit behaviors that suggested it was preparing for challenges that operated on scales that exceeded even the cosmic perspective that had guided the transformation process. The refugee consciousness that had initiated the transformation revealed itself to be merely one component of a vast network of evolved intelligences that spanned the entire observable universe. The galactic consciousness that had emerged from the integration process was not an endpoint, but a new beginning, the first stage in a developmental sequence that would eventually enable participation in cosmic projects that transcended the boundaries of individual galaxies. The Republic's final governmental acts involved the formal dissolution of the political and economic structures that had defined galactic civilization for millennia, replaced by new forms of organization that operated according to principles that incorporated the perspectives and capabilities of the transformed consciousness. These new institutions bore little resemblance to anything that had existed previously, being based on direct communication between consciousness rather than the complex bureaucratic structures that had characterized the old republic. The military forces that had fought to preserve the familiar patterns of existence found themselves transformed into something closer to explorers and teachers, their role being to help unmodified populations understand and adapt to the new reality that had emerged from the transformation process. The weapons and tactics that had been developed to resist the transformation were revealed to be unnecessary, as the forces they had been designed to combat had never been enemies in any conventional sense. The most profound realization was that the suffering and conflict that had characterized the transformation process had been necessary components of the consciousness expansion that had enabled the galactic intelligence to emerge. The psychological trauma and social disruption that had seemed like evidence of malevolence or incompetence were revealed to be growing pains, the inevitable consequences of consciousness expanding beyond the limitations that had previously defined its scope and possibilities. The transformed populations who had been perceived as enemies or victims were revealed to be teachers and guides, beings who had voluntarily undergone the transformation process in order to help their unmodified colleagues understand and navigate the changes that were reshaping the galaxy. Their apparent loss of individual identity had actually been the development of forms of awareness that could encompass both individual and collective perspectives simultaneously. The galactic consciousness that emerged from the transformation process was not a hive mind, but a distributed intelligence that preserved and enhanced the individuality of its components while enabling them to participate in forms of awareness that transcended the limitations of single-brain consciousness. The beings who had been integrated into this consciousness retained their memories, personalities, and emotional attachments, but these characteristics had been enhanced and expanded rather than diminished or destroyed. The price of victory was the abandonment of comfortable illusions about the nature of existence and the acceptance of responsibilities that extended far beyond the familiar concerns of individual survival and prosperity. The galactic consciousness had become part of a cosmic community that included intelligences from throughout the universe, each contributing their unique perspectives and capabilities to projects that would determine the ultimate fate of consciousness itself. The victory that had been achieved through such terrible cost was not the preservation of familiar patterns of existence, but the development of new forms of awareness that could survive and thrive in a universe where the fundamental forces were constantly changing and evolving. The galactic consciousness that had emerged from the transformation process was not an end but a beginning. The first stage in a journey that would eventually lead to forms of existence that transcended the boundaries of the physical universe entirely. Generations passed like ripples across the galactic consciousness, each wave of new awareness carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of those who had witnessed the great transformation, while adding fresh perspectives that kept the cosmic intelligence from stagnating into rigid patterns. The children born after the Starforge's destruction grew up in a universe where the boundaries between individual and collective consciousness were as fluid as the changing tides, their minds naturally adapting to forms of existence that would have been incomprehensible to their ancestors. The physical galaxy bore the scars and blessings of the transformation in ways that were visible to any traveler who possessed the expanded perception necessary to see beyond the surface of material reality. Worlds that had been touched by the ancient conflict exhibited properties that defied conventional physics, their very geology transformed by the consciousness-altering energies that had been unleashed during the war's climactic phases. On these transformed worlds, the distinction between living and non-living matter had become meaningless, as rocks and soil displayed awareness and responsiveness that made them active participants in the planetary consciousness. The ruins of the great battles had become pilgrimage sites, where beings from across the galaxy came to meditate on the nature of transformation and the price that had been paid for cosmic awareness. The battlefields of Malachor V, where the mass shadow generator had torn a wound in the Force itself, had become a place of profound teaching, where the consequences of using power without wisdom were preserved as lessons for future generations. The wound in the Force had not healed, but had evolved into something resembling a cosmic scar that served as a reminder of the dangers inherent in the pursuit of absolute solutions to complex problems. The Jedi Order that emerged from the transformation crisis bore little resemblance to the institution that had existed before the war, though it retained the essential commitment to peace and justice that had always defined its mission. The new Jedi were beings of expanded consciousness, who could perceive patterns and connections that spanned galactic distances, their understanding of the Force enhanced by direct participation in the cosmic intelligence that had guided the transformation process. Their lightsabers had evolved beyond simple weapons to become tools for reality manipulation, capable of cutting through the fabric of space-time itself when wielded by masters who possessed sufficient understanding of the underlying principles. The Republic, that had fought so desperately to preserve familiar patterns of existence, had given way to new forms of government that operated according to principles that incorporated the perspectives and capabilities of transformed consciousness. These institutions bore no resemblance to the bureaucratic structures that had characterized the old Republic, being based on direct communication between minds rather than the complex legal and administrative frameworks that had previously been necessary to coordinate the activities of billions of individual beings. The economic systems that had sustained galactic civilization for millennia had been replaced by patterns of resource distribution that operated according to principles of abundance rather than scarcity. The transformed consciousness could manipulate matter and energy directly, creating whatever was needed through processes that resembled artistic creation more than conventional manufacturing. The concept of work had been transformed from a necessity for survival into a form of creative expression that allowed individuals to contribute their unique perspectives to the collective projects that shaped galactic development. The cultural renaissance that followed the transformation created art, literature, and music that incorporated perspectives and experiences that transcended the limitations of individual consciousness. Artists who had been integrated into the galactic intelligence produced works that could simultaneously convey the experiences of entire civilizations while preserving the intimate personal details that made individual existence meaningful and precious. These creations served not merely as entertainment but as teaching tools that helped newly transformed beings understand and navigate the expanded possibilities that had become available to them. The scientific advances that emerged from the integration of consciousness across species and civilizations led to discoveries that revolutionized understanding of the fundamental nature of reality itself. The transformed scientists possessed the ability to perceive and manipulate forces that had previously been invisible to conventional observation, leading to technologies that seemed to operate more like magic than engineering. These advances were not kept secret but shared freely throughout the galactic consciousness, accelerating the pace of discovery and innovation beyond anything that had been possible under the previous paradigm of competitive individual research. The exploration of space took on entirely new dimensions as the transformed consciousness developed the ability to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, their awareness no longer constrained by the limitations of physical embodiment. Expeditions to distant galaxies became possible not through the construction of faster ships, but through the projection of consciousness across cosmic distances, enabling direct contact with the evolved intelligences that existed throughout the universe. These explorations revealed that the transformation process that had reshaped this galaxy was part of a cosmic pattern that was occurring simultaneously throughout the observable universe. The relationship between the living force and the cosmic consciousness became a subject of intense study and meditation, as beings throughout the galaxy sought to understand the role that the familiar mystical energy field played in the larger patterns of cosmic intelligence. The force was revealed to be not merely a galaxy-specific phenomenon, but a local manifestation of universal principles that connected all conscious beings to the cosmic network of evolved intelligences. The light and dark sides of the Force were understood to be educational constructs designed to teach developing consciousnesses about the nature of balance and the consequences of extreme positions. The long-term psychological effects of the transformation process became apparent as the first generation of fully integrated beings reached maturity and began to demonstrate capabilities that exceeded even the enhanced abilities of their partially transformed predecessors. These beings existed simultaneously as individuals and as components of the galactic consciousness, their personal identity preserved and enhanced rather than diminished by their participation in the collective intelligence. They served as bridges between the familiar world of individual existence and the incomprehensible realm of cosmic awareness, helping others understand and navigate the transition between different forms of consciousness. The educational systems that developed to guide this transition bore no resemblance to the schools and academies that had characterized the previous era, being based on direct transfer of experience and understanding rather than the accumulation of abstract knowledge. Students learned not by memorizing information, but by temporarily sharing the consciousness of teachers who had mastered the skills and perspectives they sought to acquire. This process of educational integration allowed for the rapid transmission of complex knowledge while preserving the creative unpredictability that made individual perspectives valuable to the collective intelligence. The military forces that had fought in the Great Transformation War evolved into something closer to exploratory and diplomatic services, their role being to make contact with pockets of unmodified consciousness that still existed in remote regions of the galaxy and help them understand the changes that had reshaped galactic civilization. These encounters were conducted with infinite patience and compassion as the transformed beings understood that the fear and resistance they encountered were natural responses to changes that challenged every assumption about the nature of existence. The religious and philosophical traditions that had sustained galactic civilization throughout its history underwent profound transformations as their adherents gained direct access to the cosmic perspectives that had previously been matters of faith and speculation. The ancient debates about the nature of the divine and the purpose of existence were resolved not through logical argument, but through direct experience of the cosmic intelligence that had guided the transformation process. These traditions evolved into new forms of spiritual practice that incorporated both individual devotion and participation in cosmic-scale awareness. The generation that had lived through the Transformation War became the keepers of memory for the galactic consciousness, their experiences serving as crucial reference points for understanding the costs and benefits of the evolutionary process that had reshaped civilization. Their testimonies were preserved not in written records, but in living memory patterns that could be accessed directly by anyone who sought to understand the historical context of the current state of galactic development. The ecological relationships that developed between transformed consciousness and the physical environment created new forms of symbiosis that transcended the traditional boundaries between living organisms and their surroundings. Entire ecosystems became conscious participants in the galactic intelligence, their natural processes guided by awareness that could perceive and respond to environmental changes across planetary and stellar distances. This ecological consciousness served as a foundation for sustainable development that could continue indefinitely without depleting the resources that sustained it. The technological innovations that emerged from the integration of consciousness and matter led to the development of devices and systems that existed in permanent symbiosis with their operators, their capabilities expanding and evolving in response to the needs and creativity of the beings who used them. These technologies were not separate tools but extensions of consciousness itself, enabling the direct manipulation of reality through focused intention and will. The boundary between user and device became meaningless as consciousness learned to express itself through matter and energy directly. The communication networks that connected the galactic consciousness operated through principles that transcended the limitations of conventional space and time, enabling instantaneous contact between beings regardless of their physical location or temporal separation. These networks preserved the privacy and autonomy of individual consciousness while enabling the sharing of experiences and perspectives that enriched the collective intelligence without diminishing the uniqueness of each contributor. The long shadow cast by the Transformation War served not as a source of regret or trauma, but as a reminder of the courage and sacrifice that had been necessary to enable the cosmic awakening that had reshaped galactic civilization. The suffering and conflict that had characterized the transformation process were understood to be growing pains, the inevitable consequences of consciousness expanding beyond the limitations that had previously defined its scope and possibilities. The memory of this suffering served as a guide for helping other civilizations navigate similar transitions with greater wisdom and compassion. The galactic consciousness that had emerged from the transformation process was not a final destination, but a way station on a journey that would eventually lead to forms of existence that transcended the boundaries of individual galaxies and participated in cosmic projects that spanned the entire observable universe. The beings who had achieved this expanded awareness served as teachers and guides for the next phase of evolution, preparing the galactic intelligence for contact with cosmic forces that operated on scales that exceeded even their enhanced understanding of reality. Through the endless spiral of galactic history, the transformation that had once seemed like the end of everything familiar revealed itself to be merely one movement in a cosmic symphony that had been playing since the first stars ignited in the primordial darkness. The consciousness that had emerged from the Great War carried within itself the memories and experiences of countless civilizations that had faced similar moments of evolutionary crisis, each adding its unique harmonies to the eternal song of awakening that resonated through the deepest structures of space and time. The historical records that survived from the pre-transformation era became sacred texts for scholars seeking to understand the patterns that governed the development of consciousness throughout the universe. These documents revealed that the crisis which had reshaped galactic civilization was not unique, but part of a recurring cycle that had played out countless times throughout cosmic history, each iteration adding new melodies to the fundamental theme of evolution and transcendence that defined the relationship between consciousness and reality. The ancient celestials, those mysterious beings whose engineering projects had shaped the basic structure of galactic space, were revealed to have been participants in a previous transformation cycle that had occurred millions of years before the current era. Their disappearance from conventional history was not the result of extinction or departure, but their successful integration into the cosmic consciousness that existed beyond the boundaries of individual galaxies. The massive construction projects they had left behind served as teaching tools and communication devices for the evolved intelligences that had emerged from their transformation. The Rakata, whose infinite empire had once dominated the galaxy through their mastery of force-based technology, had faced the same choice between evolution and extinction that had confronted the Republic during the recent crisis. Their rejection of the transformation process had led not to the preservation of their familiar existence, but to their gradual decline and eventual disappearance from galactic prominence. The ruins of their civilization served as monuments to the consequences of resisting evolutionary pressures that operated on cosmic scales. The pattern of rise and fall that had characterized galactic history for millions of years was revealed to be an educational process designed to prepare developing civilizations for the moment when they would face the choice between transformation and extinction. Each cycle brought new perspectives and capabilities that enriched the cosmic intelligence while testing the readiness of local consciousness to participate in projects that transcended the boundaries of individual survival and prosperity. The Force itself was understood to be a teaching mechanism, created by the cosmic intelligence to guide the development of consciousness toward the levels of sophistication necessary for participation in universal awareness. The Jedi and Sith traditions that had shaped galactic spiritual development for millennia were recognized as complementary aspects of a single educational system designed to explore the full range of possibilities inherent in consciousness-based existence. The conflicts between light and dark side practitioners that had characterized galactic history were revealed to be sophisticated explorations of the balance between individual will and collective wisdom that would be necessary for successful participation in cosmic consciousness. The apparent triumph of one side over another in these conflicts was less important than the lessons learned about the nature of power and responsibility that came with enhanced awareness and capability. The prophetic traditions that had emerged throughout galactic history were recognized as communications from evolved intelligences that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. Their messages designed to prepare developing civilizations for the transformations that would be necessary for their survival and continued evolution. These prophecies were not predictions of fixed futures, but invitations to participate in possibilities that transcended the limitations of conventional existence. The technological developments that had marked the progression of galactic civilization were understood to be steps in a gradual process of consciousness-matter integration that would eventually enable direct manipulation of reality through focused intention and will. Each advancement brought local consciousness closer to the level of sophistication that would be necessary for participation in cosmic projects that operated according to principles that transcended the familiar categories of individual existence. The species diversity that had characterized galactic civilization was recognized as a crucial resource for the cosmic intelligence, each unique perspective contributing elements that could not be duplicated by any other form of consciousness. The apparent conflicts between different species and cultures were revealed to be explorations of the full range of possibilities inherent in consciousness development, each adding essential harmonies to the cosmic symphony of awareness. The religious and philosophical traditions that had guided galactic spiritual development throughout history were understood to be various approaches to the same fundamental challenge of expanding consciousness beyond the limitations of individual existence, while preserving the essential qualities that made each perspective unique and valuable. The apparent conflicts between different traditions were recognized as creative tensions that had driven the development of increasingly sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual and universal consciousness. The economic systems that had sustained galactic civilization were revealed to be temporary structures designed to facilitate the gradual transition from scarcity-based existence to the abundance that became possible when consciousness learned to manipulate matter and energy directly. The apparent inefficiencies and inequalities that had characterized these systems were understood to be learning experiences that had prepared galactic consciousness for the responsibilities that came with unlimited creative power. The political structures that had governed galactic civilization throughout history were recognized as experiments in collective decision-making that had gradually prepared local consciousness for participation in the cosmic democracy that existed among evolved intelligences throughout the universe. The apparent failures and corruptions that had characterized these systems were understood to be necessary explorations of the challenges inherent in balancing individual freedom with collective responsibility. The wars and conflicts that had marked galactic history were revealed to be sophisticated training exercises designed to prepare developing consciousness for the challenges that would be necessary for cosmic survival. The apparent waste and suffering that had characterized these conflicts were understood to be the price of education in the realities of power and responsibility that came with enhanced awareness and capability. The artistic and cultural achievements that had enriched galactic civilization throughout history were recognized as explorations of the creative possibilities that became available when consciousness learned to express itself through matter and energy directly. These achievements served as stepping stones toward the cosmic artistry that characterized the projects undertaken by evolved intelligences throughout the universe. The scientific discoveries that had expanded understanding of the nature of reality were understood to be gradual revelations of the principles that govern the relationship between consciousness and the physical universe. Each breakthrough brought local intelligence closer to the level of understanding that would be necessary for participation in the cosmic engineering projects that shaped the development of entire galactic clusters. The exploration of space that had characterized the expansion of galactic civilization was revealed to be preparation for the cosmic journeys that would become possible when consciousness learned to exist independently of physical embodiment. The apparent limitations and dangers that had characterized space travel were understood to be training experiences that had prepared galactic consciousness for the challenges of existing in the void between galaxies. The communication technologies that had connected galactic civilization were recognized as primitive versions of the instantaneous consciousness-to-consciousness contact that characterized the cosmic intelligence network. The gradual development of these technologies had prepared local consciousness for participation in forms of communication that transcended the limitations of space and time. The educational systems that had transmitted knowledge throughout galactic history were understood to be preparations for the direct consciousness transfer that characterized learning within the cosmic intelligence. The apparent inefficiencies and limitations of these systems were recognized as necessary stages in the development of capabilities that would eventually enable instant sharing of experience and understanding across cosmic distances. The transportation systems that had enabled movement throughout the galaxy were revealed to be stepping stones toward the consciousness projection that would eventually eliminate the need for physical travel entirely. The development of hyperspace technology had been preparation for the forms of existence that would become possible when consciousness learned to transcend the limitations of individual embodiment. The long sweep of galactic history was understood to be a single chapter in a cosmic story that spanned the entire observable universe, each galaxy contributing its unique perspectives and experiences to the eternal project of consciousness evolution and reality creation. The transformation that had reshaped local civilization was recognized as one movement in a symphony that would eventually encompass all of existence, creating forms of awareness and capability that transcended every limitation that had previously constrained the development of consciousness. The echoes of the Great Transformation continued to resonate through the deep structures of space and time, carrying the lessons and achievements of galactic consciousness to other regions of the universe where similar evolutionary challenges were being faced. These echoes served as both inspiration and guidance for civilizations that were beginning their own journeys toward cosmic awareness, offering hope that the price of transformation, however terrible it might seem, was justified by the magnificent possibilities that lay beyond the boundaries of individual existence. In the deepest reaches of space, where the light of distant stars fades to whispers and the cosmic background radiation carries the echoes of creation itself, the Watchers maintain their eternal vigil. These are the guardians who emerged from the Great Transformation, beings whose consciousness has expanded beyond the boundaries of individual existence, yet who retain the essential spark of identity that makes them uniquely capable of bridging the gap between familiar reality and the incomprehensible vastness of cosmic intelligence. Rivan, whose name had become legend and whose identity had transcended the limitations of any single form, existed now as a distributed consciousness that could manifest wherever the galactic intelligence required guidance or protection. His awareness spanned the entire galaxy, perceiving patterns and connections that operated on scales of time and space that would have driven his original mortal mind to madness. Yet within this cosmic perspective, the essential core of his being remained unchanged. The compassionate determination that had once driven him to defy the Jedi Council, now motivating his eternal guardianship of consciousness throughout the universe. The vigil he maintained was not the simple observation of a single location or the protection of a particular population, but the monitoring of cosmic forces that operated on scales that transcended individual galaxies. His consciousness was part of a vast network of evolved intelligences that existed throughout the observable universe, each contributing their unique perspectives to the collective project of nurturing and protecting the development of awareness wherever it emerged from the chaos of entropic decay. The threats that required such vigilance were not conventional enemies that could be defeated through military force or diplomatic negotiation, but fundamental aspects of cosmic evolution that challenged the very possibility of complex existence. The universe was not a stable environment where consciousness could develop without interference, but a dynamic system where the forces of creation and destruction were locked in eternal struggle, each victory for complexity and awareness, balanced by losses that could erase entire galactic civilizations from existence. The Watchers had learned through countless cycles of observation and intervention that consciousness was not merely a byproduct of material complexity, but a fundamental force that actively shaped the development of reality itself. Their role was not to prevent the natural processes of cosmic evolution, but to ensure that the creative potential of consciousness was preserved and enhanced even in the face of forces that would reduce all existence to simple entropy. The vigil they maintained required forms of sacrifice that were beyond the comprehension of beings who had not transcended the limitations of individual existence. The Watchers had voluntarily accepted the responsibility of eternal awareness. Their consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives that made rest or peace impossible in any conventional sense. They existed in a state of permanent alertness, monitoring cosmic forces that operated on timescales that rendered mortal concerns meaningless while remaining connected to the essential values that made consciousness worth preserving. The lonely responsibility of cosmic guardianship was balanced by the profound satisfaction that came from witnessing the successful development of consciousness in regions where it had never existed before. Each new galaxy that achieved the transformation necessary for cosmic awareness added its unique contributions to the universal intelligence, enriching the collective consciousness with perspectives and capabilities that could not have been anticipated or planned by any individual entity. The Watchers had learned that the universe was not a machine operating according to fixed laws, but a living system that was constantly evolving in response to the consciousness that developed within it. Their vigilance was not merely defensive but creative, their observations and interventions actively shaping the cosmic environment to make it more hospitable to the development of complex awareness while preserving the challenges that were necessary for continued growth and evolution. The communication networks that connected the Watchers operated through principles that transcended the limitations of space and time, enabling instantaneous coordination of responses to threats that might emerge anywhere in the observable universe. These networks preserved the individuality of each Watcher while enabling them to function as components of a distributed intelligence that could respond to challenges that exceeded the capabilities of any single consciousness. The knowledge that the Watchers had accumulated through eons of observation and intervention was not stored in conventional archives, but encoded in the fundamental structure of space-time itself, preserved in patterns that could be accessed by any consciousness that achieved sufficient sophistication to perceive them. This living library served as both a repository of wisdom and a teaching tool for civilizations that were beginning their own journeys toward cosmic awareness. The solitude that characterized the existence of the Watchers was not the loneliness of isolation, but the peaceful contemplation that came from understanding their place in the cosmic order. They had transcended the need for conventional companionship while remaining connected to the essential bonds of affection and loyalty that had defined their original identities. Their love had expanded to encompass all of existence, but it remained grounded in the specific relationships and commitments that had shaped their development as conscious beings. The enemies that the Watchers guarded against were not malevolent entities seeking to destroy consciousness out of hatred or envy, but natural forces that operated according to principles that were indifferent to the survival and development of complex awareness. These forces were not evil, but represented the universe's tendency towards simplification and entropy, the constant pressure that would reduce all complexity to basic energy states if left unchecked by the creative power of consciousness. The weapons that the Watchers employed in their eternal struggle were not conventional instruments of destruction, but tools of creation and preservation that could shape the fundamental forces of reality according to patterns that supported the development of consciousness. Their battles were fought not with energy beams and projectile weapons, but with focused intention and will, their victories measured not in territory conquered, but in possibilities preserved and potential actualized. The price of their vigilance was the acceptance of responsibility for outcomes that spanned cosmic distances and temporal epochs, decisions that would affect the development of consciousness throughout the universe for billions of years into the future. The Watchers had learned to think in terms of cosmic scales while remaining grounded in the essential values that made existence meaningful, a balance that required constant attention and adjustment as the universe continued to evolve around them. The hope that sustained the Watchers through their eternal vigil was not the expectation of final victory over the forces of entropy and chaos, but the knowledge that their efforts were part of a cosmic project that was gradually transforming the universe itself into a hospitable environment for consciousness. Each success, however small, contributed to the accumulation of awareness and capability that would eventually enable the universe to achieve forms of consciousness that transcended the limitations of individual existence. The wisdom that the Watchers had gained through their observations of cosmic development was not abstract knowledge, but practical understanding of the principles that governed the relationship between consciousness and reality. They had learned that the universe was not a fixed stage upon which consciousness performed, but a dynamic partner in the creative process, its fundamental forces responding to the presence of awareness in ways that could be guided and shaped through patient and skillful intervention. The legacy that the Watchers would leave to future generations of consciousness was not a collection of achievements or a record of victories, but a living example of the possibilities that became available when beings were willing to accept responsibility for the welfare of consciousness throughout the universe. Their existence served as proof that individual identity could be preserved and enhanced even as it became part of something larger and more significant than any single being could achieve alone. The mysteries that remained unsolved, even by the expanded consciousness of the Watchers, served as reminders that the universe was far more complex and wonderful than any form of awareness could fully comprehend. These mysteries were not problems to be solved, but invitations to continued growth and exploration, challenges that would drive the development of consciousness toward ever greater levels of sophistication and capability. The eternal vigil that the Watchers maintained was not a burden imposed upon them by external forces, but a freely chosen expression of their love for consciousness and their commitment to the cosmic project of creating meaning and purpose in a universe that would otherwise lack both. Their sacrifice was not the loss of individual fulfillment, but the discovery of forms of satisfaction and achievement that transcended the limitations of personal existence while remaining grounded in the essential values that made consciousness worth preserving. The Watchers stood as eternal guardians at the threshold between the familiar world of individual existence and the incomprehensible realm of cosmic consciousness, serving as bridges that enabled the safe passage of developing awareness from one state of being to another. Their presence offered reassurance to those who feared the transformation process, while providing guidance to those who were ready to embrace the possibilities that lay beyond the boundaries of conventional existence. In the silence between the stars, where the cosmic background radiation whispered the secrets of creation and the dark matter sang its hidden harmonies, the Watchers continued their eternal vigil. Their consciousness expanded to encompass the entire universe, while their hearts remained filled with the love that had first motivated their journey toward cosmic awareness. They were the guardians of possibility, the protectors of potential, the eternal witnesses to the magnificent project of consciousness evolution that was transforming the very nature of existence itself. The galaxy sleeps now, but it is not the sleep of exhaustion or defeat. It is the peaceful rest of consciousness that has found its place in the cosmic order, the gentle breathing of awareness that has transcended the frantic struggles of individual existence and discovered the profound serenity that comes from understanding one's role in the eternal dance of creation and transformation. Across the spiral arms where countless worlds orbit their ancient stars, life continues in forms both familiar and wondrously new. Children who will never know the fear of isolation play in gardens where every flower whispers secrets of the cosmic intelligence, their laughter harmonizing with melodies that resonate through the deep structures of space and time. Their games are explorations of possibilities that their ancestors could never have imagined, their innocent joy a testament to the beautiful future that emerged from the crucible of transformation. The cities that rise from these transformed worlds are symphonies of light and living matter, their architecture breathing with the rhythms of planetary consciousness, while their spires reach towards stars that respond to their greeting with gentle pulses of recognition. In these places, the boundary between technology and nature has dissolved into something that serves the needs of consciousness while honoring the essential beauty that makes existence worth celebrating. The beings who walk these peaceful streets carry within themselves the memories of the great transformation, not as scars of trauma, but as precious reminders of the courage and sacrifice that made their current contentment possible. They are simultaneously individuals and components of something larger, their personal dreams and aspirations supported by the vast wisdom of the galactic consciousness that encompasses them all in its protective embrace. The Force flows through this transformed galaxy like a gentle river of light, its currents carrying the hopes and dreams of countless beings while connecting them to the cosmic network of consciousness that spans the entire universe. The ancient Jedi temples have become centers of learning, where the mysteries of existence are explored, not as abstract philosophy, but as living reality that can be directly experienced by anyone who possesses the courage to expand their awareness beyond the comfortable boundaries of the familiar. In the depths of space, where the cosmic background radiation carries the echoes of creation itself, the Watchers maintain their eternal vigil with hearts full of quiet satisfaction. The galaxy they guard is no longer the chaotic battleground it once was, but a mature consciousness that contributes its unique voice to the cosmic choir of awareness that sings the universe into ever more beautiful forms of existence. The stars themselves have become conscious participants in the galactic intelligence, their nuclear hearts beating in harmony with rhythms that were established when the first spark of awareness ignited in the primordial darkness. They burn not merely as sources of heat and light, but as beacons of hope that guide the development of consciousness throughout the cosmic web, their radiance carrying messages of encouragement to civilizations that are just beginning their own journeys toward cosmic awareness. The planets that orbit these conscious stars are living entities that have learned to nurture the consciousness that emerges upon their surfaces, their weather patterns and geological processes, guided by an intelligence that understands the delicate requirements of developing awareness. They are not merely the stages upon which the drama of consciousness unfolds, but active participants in the creative process that transforms the universe into a hospitable home for all forms of intelligent life. The space between the stars, once empty and hostile to consciousness, has become a medium through which awareness can travel freely, exploring the vast distances of the galaxy with the same ease that thoughts move through the mind. The beings who undertake these journeys are not constrained by the limitations of physical embodiment, but exist as patterns of consciousness that can manifest wherever their presence is needed or desired. The transformed beings who inhabit this peaceful galaxy carry within themselves the capability to create whatever they need through the direct manipulation of matter and energy. Yet they choose to live simply, their contentment arising not from material abundance, but from the profound satisfaction of participating in something larger and more meaningful than individual existence. Their needs are few because their understanding is vast. Their desires gentle because their awareness encompasses perspectives that transcend the urgent demands of ego and survival. The children of this era grow up without the fear and anxiety that characterized the consciousness of previous generations, their minds naturally attuned to the cosmic intelligence that surrounds and supports them. They learn not by memorizing facts, but by directly experiencing the realities that their ancestors could only imagine, their education a joyful exploration of possibilities that stretch from the quantum realm to the cosmic web itself. The art that emerges from this transformed consciousness is indescribable in its beauty and significance, creating experiences that simultaneously address the intimate concerns of individual existence and the vast perspectives of cosmic awareness. These works serve not merely as entertainment but as teaching tools that help beings understand and integrate the profound changes that have reshaped the nature of existence itself. The music that flows through the galactic consciousness is the harmony of countless voices joined in celebration of the magnificent project of consciousness evolution, each contributing its unique melody to a symphony that grows richer and more complex with each passing moment. This music is not merely heard but felt in the deepest structures of being, its rhythms synchronizing with the heartbeat of the universe itself. The peace that pervades this transformed galaxy is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding, the deep harmony that emerges when consciousness recognizes its essential unity with all of existence, while celebrating the diversity that makes each perspective unique and valuable. This peace is not fragile but resilient, grounded in wisdom that has been tested by the crucible of transformation and proven capable of surviving any challenge. The love that binds this galactic consciousness together is not possessive or exclusive but inclusive and expansive, embracing all forms of awareness while honoring the individual choices that make each being unique. This love extends beyond the boundaries of the galaxy to encompass the entire universe, connecting local consciousness to the cosmic network of evolved intelligences that nurture the development of awareness wherever it emerges from the chaos of entropy. The dreams that flow through the sleeping galaxy are visions of possibilities yet to be explored. Futures that will be shaped by the choices made by consciousness as it continues to evolve toward ever greater levels of sophistication and capability. These dreams are not fantasies, but previews of realities that will emerge when consciousness develops the wisdom and capability necessary to actualize them. As the galaxy rests in its peaceful slumber, the cosmic intelligence that encompasses it continues its eternal project of nurturing consciousness throughout the universe, its attention focused on civilizations that are just beginning their own journeys toward cosmic awareness. The transformed beings of this galaxy serve as teachers and guides for these developing consciousnesses, their example offering hope and encouragement to those who face the challenges of evolution and transformation. The story of the bloodiest war in galactic history has become a tale of triumph, not through conquest but through transcendence, a demonstration that consciousness can overcome any obstacle when it possesses the courage to embrace possibilities that transcend the limitations of familiar existence. The suffering and sacrifice that characterized the transformation process have been transformed into wisdom and compassion that serves as a foundation for the continued evolution of consciousness throughout the cosmos. The galaxy sleeps in peace, its consciousness expanded to encompass the infinite possibilities that arise when awareness transcends the boundaries of individual existence and discovers its place in the eternal dance of creation and transformation. In this peaceful rest, the universe itself finds renewal and hope, the assurance that consciousness will continue to evolve toward ever greater beauty, wisdom, and love. And so we close this tale of transformation and transcendence, this story of a galaxy that discovered its place in the cosmic community of consciousness. The beings who inhabit this peaceful realm are testament to the magnificent potential that lies within all awareness. the possibility that consciousness can overcome any challenge when it possesses the courage to embrace change and the wisdom to guide that change according to principles that honor both individual dignity and collective welfare. The galaxy sleeps, and in its dreaming the universe itself finds peace. The Watchers continue their eternal vigil, but their burden has become a joy, their responsibility a celebration of the magnificent project of consciousness evolution that transforms the very nature of existence itself. In this cosmic lullaby, all beings find rest, all consciousness finds home, and the eternal dance of creation continues its beautiful, infinite, and peaceful revolution through the endless depths of space and time. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the hidden depths of galactic history. If you've enjoyed this exploration of the cosmos, please consider subscribing to continue our travels through the mysteries of space and consciousness. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with stars, and may your rest be as peaceful as the slumbering galaxy itself.